There is a place on this earth where the rock remembers things that human beings have forgotten, where the stone itself holds secrets so old that the languages used to first speak about them no longer exist in any living mouth, where the ground beneath your feet, if you were standing at the southern rim on a quiet morning before the tourist buses arrived, would feel different. Not because of anything you could point to or name, just different, heavy in a way that has nothing to do with geology, dense in a way that goes deeper than the layers of limestone and sandstone and shale that every park ranger can recite in order from youngest to oldest. There is something beneath the Grand Canyon that the rock has been keeping to itself for a very long time, and in the last few years, the instruments we've built finally became sensitive enough to hear it. This is not a story that begins with scientists. It begins, the way most true things begin, with people who are paying attention long before the rest of us thought to look. It begins with voices that were speaking clearly for centuries while everyone around them was too busy assuming those voices were telling stories. It begins underground, in the dark, in the specific kind of silence that exists only when you are surrounded by stone on all sides, and the nearest sunlight is hundreds of feet above your head. It begins with a question that a small number of researchers, and a much larger number of indigenous elders, have been asking for generations. What is actually down there? If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Close your eyes for just a moment. Not all the way, not so you lose the thread of what I'm telling you, but enough to let the image form. You are standing at the edge of the canyon just as the sun clears the eastern horizon. The light comes in low and amber, and it hits the upper walls first, the Kaibab limestone, pale and almost white, and then it moves down through the Torowep Formation and the Coconino Sandstone and the Hermit Shale, and each layer catches the light differently, each one a different color, a different era of the Earth's autobiography, laid open for anyone willing to look. The canyon is a mile deep at its deepest point. It is 18 miles wide in some places. It is 277 miles long if you follow the river. The Colorado River at the bottom looks like a green thread from where you're standing, something a child might draw to represent water, impossibly small, impossibly far away, and yet that thread of water is what cut all of this. That thread of water over 5 to 6 million years of patient, unrelenting work carved through 2 billion years of accumulated stone and showed us the inside of the Earth's memory. But the canyon that you can see, the canyon that has been photographed billions of times, the canyon that appears on screensavers and travel blogs and in every nature documentary that needs a shot of something vast and ancient and humbling, that canyon is only the part that's visible. What the new scans are showing, what the data collected over the past several years has been slowly, carefully, undeniably revealing, is that the visible canyon is not the whole story. Not even close. Beneath the canyon that you can see, beneath the river that carved it, beneath the ancient basement rock that scientists call the Vishnu schist and the Zoroaster granite, formations so old they make the dinosaurs look recent, beneath all of that, there is something that the geology alone cannot explain. A network. A system. Something that runs through the rock in patterns that natural water erosion does not produce. Something that the Hopi people have been calling the Sipapu for as long as they have had words for what lies beneath the world. Something that the Havasupai elders, the people who have lived inside the canyon longer than any other group currently living, describe as the place where the first people came from. Something that the Navajo oral histories reference as the pathway between the lower worlds and this one. Something that the Zuni call the Road of the Ancestors. A phrase that their ceremonial leaders use in a context that makes it clear they do not mean it metaphorically. The new scans found a tunnel network beneath the Grand Canyon. That sentence, when it appeared in the internal communications of the research team that conducted the most recent survey, was careful and technical, and surrounded by the kind of language that scientists use when they want to say something extraordinary, without sounding like they are saying something extraordinary. The phrase used was anomalous subsurface void structures exhibiting non-random spatial organization. What that means, translated out of the careful language of academic geology, is that there are hollow spaces under the canyon, and those hollow spaces are arranged in patterns that don't happen by accident. They go somewhere, they connect to each other, they form something, and nobody, not the geologists, not the archaeologists, not the engineers who designed the scanning equipment, can tell you with any confidence what that something is, where it leads, or how old it actually is. What I'm going to tell you tonight is the fullest picture that currently exists of this mystery. I'm going to tell you what the scans found and how they found it. I'm going to tell you what the oral traditions of 4 different Native American nations have been saying about the space beneath the canyon for longer than written American history has existed. I'm going to tell you about the 1,909 newspaper account that described a discovery so significant that if it had been made in Egypt, it would have rewritten every textbook on Earth, and that instead was quietly, almost completely buried within weeks of its publication. I'm going to tell you about the researchers who have spent years trying to reconcile what the instruments are detecting with what the geology books say should be there. And I'm going to tell you about the questions that remain, the ones that the scans opened rather than closed, the ones that the elders have been sitting with patiently for generations, the ones that keep the people who study this professionally awake at night even when they would very much prefer to sleep. This is not a story with a clean ending. The Grand Canyon itself doesn't have a clean ending. It just keeps going, down and further down, past the layers you can name and into the layers that are older than naming, older than the first creatures that developed the biological equipment necessary to wonder about where they were and what was beneath them. The story of what lies beneath the Grand Canyon is a story about the limits of what we know. It's about the gap between the official record and the full record. It's about what happens when instruments start confirming what storytellers have been saying for centuries, and the people holding the instruments aren't quite sure what to do with that. Let's start where the story starts, not with the scans, not with the scientists, but with the place itself, with what it is and what it has always been to the people who knew it first. The Grand Canyon did not become a wonder of the world when Theodore Roosevelt declared it a national monument in 1908. It did not become significant when John Wesley Powell navigated the Colorado River through it in 1869. It did not become meaningful when Francisco Vázquez de Coronado sent a small scouting party to its rim in 1540, a party that spent 3 days trying to find a way down, failed, and turned back convinced the canyon was a dead end, an obstacle, something to root around rather than into. The Grand Canyon was old beyond any European concept of old before any of those men existed, and it was known intimately, specifically, in extraordinary detail by people who had been living around it and inside it and in relationship with it for thousands of years before any of those encounters. The Hopi people, whose villages on the 3 mesas of northeastern Arizona represent some of the oldest continuously occupied settlements in North America, do not think of the Grand Canyon the way the tourists who arrive by the busload think of it. They do not think of it as scenery. They do not think of it as a geological formation, though they know its geology better than most geologists because they have had longer to observe it. They think of it as a place of origin. Specifically, they think of it as the place through which the ancestors emerged into this world from the worlds below. The Sipapu, in Hopi cosmology, is the opening through which the first people came up from the 3rd world into the 4th world, which is the one we currently inhabit. In Hopi ceremonial kivas, the underground chambers where the most sacred rituals are performed, there is always a small hole in the floor. That hole is also called the Sipapu. It represents the opening, the passage, the place of emergence. It is not a metaphor. It is a geographic reference, and the place it refers to is the Grand Canyon. The Hopi elders who have been willing to speak about this with researchers, and that group is smaller than it once was, for reasons that become entirely understandable when you learn how previous conversations between their community and outside researchers have gone. Those elders are consistent on one point. The Sipapu is not the canyon as a whole. It is a specific place within the canyon, a specific opening, a specific passage. And the stories they tell about it are not stories about a spiritual symbol or a religious metaphor. They are stories about a physical place that their ancestors knew how to find, knew how to enter, and knew what was inside. Lee Kuanwisuma, who served for many years as the director of the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, has spoken carefully and on the record about the relationship between Hopi oral tradition and what lies beneath the canyon. He has described the canyon as a place of living memory for his people, a place where the boundary between the physical world and the spiritual world is thinner than it is anywhere else, but also a place that his ancestors understood in very practical, very specific, very geographic terms. The migrations that the Hopi oral histories describe, the long journeys of the clan ancestors who traveled to the four corners of the world and then returned to the center, those migrations are not spiritual journeys in the sense that they're allegorical. They are physical journeys. They are accounts of actual travel through actual landscapes. And in those accounts, there are references to underground pathways, to passages beneath the earth, to places where the ancestors could move through the rock as though the rock were not entirely solid. Now, I want to be careful here, and I want to be clear about something. The Hopi oral traditions are not evidence for a scientific hypothesis about tunnel networks in the way that a core sample or a seismic scan is evidence. They are something different. They are a different kind of knowing, a different way of holding information about the world, and they should be engaged with on their own terms before anyone tries to use them to support or undermine a geological argument. What I'm telling you is not that the Hopi stories prove the tunnels exist. What I'm telling you is that the Hopi stories describe something that the new scans are also detecting, and that the alignment between those two different ways of knowing is the kind of thing that, at minimum, deserves serious attention. At minimum, it deserves more attention than it has historically received. The Havasupai people occupy a place in this story that is different from any other group, because the Havasupai are not people who live near the canyon or have ancestral connections to the canyon. The Havasupai are people who live inside the canyon. Their reservation, Havasu Canyon, is a side canyon that branches off the main gorge, accessible for most of its history only by a trail that descends 8 miles from the rim, a trail that most people today still reach by horseback or helicopter. The Havasupai have lived in that canyon for at least 8 centuries by the most conservative archaeological estimates, and their own oral histories put the number considerably higher. They are, by any reasonable measure, the people who know the interior of the Grand Canyon better than any other living group. They know where the water runs underground. They know which sections of wall are hollow when you knock on them. They know the places where the canyon does things that canyons are not supposed to do. The Havasupai oral tradition includes accounts of what their elders call the underground roads. These are not roads in the sense that you and I would use the word. They are pathways through the rock, passages that the ancestors used to move through the canyon without being seen, without being exposed to the elements, without having to navigate the terrifying open faces of stone that make the Grand Canyon so beautiful to look at from the rim and so lethal to move through without expertise. These underground roads are described in the oral tradition as running both horizontally, connecting different parts of the canyon at the same elevation, and vertically, connecting different levels of the canyon the way a staircase connects different floors of a building. They are described as being large enough for groups of people to move through. They are described as having been used regularly and practically by the ancestors for purposes that were both ceremonial and utilitarian. The Havasupai elder Manakaja, who was interviewed by ethnographers in the early 20th century, and whose account has been preserved in the archives of the Smithsonian Institution, described what he called the world beneath the water, in terms that his interviewers clearly did not know what to do with. He spoke of passages that the ancestors had traveled through, passages that ran beneath the river, passages that connected places that no person could connect above ground because the terrain between them was impassable. His interviewers recorded his words dutifully and then apparently filed them under the category of mythology, because that is the category that was available to them, and because the idea that the ancestors of a small indigenous community had access to an underground network beneath one of the most geologically complex landscapes on Earth was not something that their conceptual framework had room for. What I keep coming back to, when I read those archived interviews, when I read the careful, respectful, but ultimately dismissive notes that the ethnographers attach to the testimony of people like Manakaja is the question of what we lose when we decide in advance what category something belongs to. The Havasupai elder was describing something specific. He was using the specific vocabulary of his specific tradition to describe something that he understood through a lifetime of living in the canyon and through the accumulated knowledge of generations of his people who had lived in the canyon before him. He was not speaking vaguely. He was not speaking allegorically. He was speaking the way a person speaks when they are telling you about a place they have been, a place they know, a place their family has known for generations. And the response, ultimately, was to write it down carefully and then set it aside as something that the modern world didn't need to take literally. The modern world is starting to reconsider that decision, not because the modern world has become more respectful of indigenous knowledge, though there is some movement in that direction, but because the instruments are now showing something that the archivists and the ethnographers and the geologists of the early 20th century could not have detected. The instruments are showing that the Havasupai elder was describing something real. Let me tell you about the scans. And to tell you about the scans, I have to tell you first about the problem that the scans were designed to solve, because that context matters for understanding what makes the results so significant. The Grand Canyon has been studied by geologists for more than 150 years. It is, in many respects, the most studied geological formation on the North American continent. The sequence of rock layers visible in its walls is so clear, so complete, so well preserved, that it serves as a kind of standard reference for understanding the geological history of the entire Colorado Plateau. Students come from around the world to study it. Researchers have drilled core samples from its walls, mapped its tributaries down to the smallest side canyon, analyzed the chemistry of its rocks, measured the rate of the river's erosion, calculated the ages of its formations to within relatively small margins of error. The surface of the Grand Canyon and the visible walls of the Grand Canyon are very well understood. The subsurface is a different matter. The rock beneath the canyon floor, beneath the level of the river, beneath the ancient basement formations that are visible at the very bottom of the main gorge. That rock has been much harder to study, for the obvious reason that you cannot see it or access it directly. You can drill into it, and researchers have done that in limited ways, but drilling gives you a very narrow, very specific sample of what is directly below the drill bit. It tells you nothing about what is 10 feet to the left or 100 feet ahead. To understand the three-dimensional structure of the rock beneath the canyon, you need tools that can see through solid stone, and for most of the history of Grand Canyon research, those tools either didn't exist or weren't sensitive enough to detect the kinds of features that would change the picture significantly. That began to change in the 1980s, when seismic reflection techniques that had been developed primarily for oil and gas exploration started to be applied to geological research contexts. And it changed more dramatically in the 2000s, when a combination of improved ground-penetrating radar technology, advanced airborne electromagnetic survey methods, and new approaches to seismic tomography, which is essentially the technique of using sound waves to create three-dimensional images of rock structure the way a medical CT scan uses X-rays to create three-dimensional images of the inside of a body, began to produce results in the Grand Canyon region that were difficult to explain using the existing geological models. The most significant of the recent surveys, the one that produced the data that has been circulating in the research community, and that prompted the internal communications using the phrase anomalous subsurface void structures exhibiting non-random spatial organization, was conducted in a series of passes between 2017 and 2022. It used a combination of airborne electromagnetic induction, which can detect variations in the electrical conductivity of rock down to considerable depths, and is particularly good at identifying hollow spaces because air conducts electricity very differently than solid rock, and a form of seismic tomography that was adapted from techniques used in volcanology, where the need to understand what is happening inside mountains that might explode has driven the development of very sensitive underground imaging technology. The survey covered approximately 60% of the main canyon corridor and a significant portion of the major tributary canyons. It was not designed to find tunnels. It was not designed to test any hypothesis about underground networks or ancient passages or anything related to the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples of the region. It was designed to improve the geological understanding of the deep structure of the Colorado Plateau, which has implications for water resource management, for understanding earthquake risk in the region, and for several other practical questions that the agencies funding the research cared about for entirely mundane reasons. The anomalous results started appearing in the data from the first season of the survey. The team's initial response was to assume instrument error, calibration issues, something wrong with the equipment, or the processing. That is the correct scientific response to results that don't match your expectations. You check your work, you check it again, you change out components, and run the survey again in the same areas to see if you get the same readings. They got the same readings. They brought in outside consultants to review the data processing methodology. The consultants confirmed the processing was sound. They compared the anomalous readings to similar surveys conducted in other geological contexts where underground voids were known to exist. Limestone cave systems in Kentucky, lava tubes in Hawaii, the karst formations of the Yucatan. The signature of the Grand Canyon anomalies matched the signature of known underground void spaces more closely than it matched any other geological feature. By the third season of the survey, the team had stopped trying to explain away the results and had started trying to describe them accurately. What they were seeing, when the data was processed and the three-dimensional model was assembled, was a series of linear features running through the rock below the canyon floor. Linear in this context is a significant word. Naturally occurring voids in rock, the caves and caverns that form through the normal processes of dissolution and erosion, are not linear. They are irregular. They follow the path of least resistance through the rock, which means they curve and branch and dead-end in ways that reflect the natural variation in rock hardness and the random paths of ancient water flow. What the Grand Canyon survey was detecting was not that. What it was detecting was organized. The void spaces ran in directions that were too consistent, too straight, too parallel to each other to be the result of random natural processes. They connected to each other at intervals that were too regular to be coincidental. And they were large, not in every location, not uniformly, but in sections. The vertical dimension of the detected voids was consistent with spaces large enough for a human being to stand upright and move through. The team published a preliminary summary of their findings in 2023 in the Journal of Geophysical Research, in language calibrated carefully to present the data without speculating about its implications. They described the anomalous features. They described the methods used to detect them. They described the degree to which the features were inconsistent with known geological processes. They described several possible explanations, including the possibility that the features represented a previously unknown type of natural void formation related to the specific geological history of the Colorado Plateau. They did not, in the published paper, mention the Hopi concept of the Sipapu. They did not mention the Havasupai accounts of underground roads. They did not mention the 1909 newspaper report. They did not speculate about the age of the features or whether they might have been modified by human activity at any point in their history. They presented the data and described what the data showed and left the implications for future researchers to pursue. But the implications are there. They are in the data. And the people who have been reading data like this for their careers, the geologists and the geophysicists and the archaeologists who reviewed the paper and discussed it at conferences and exchanged emails about it in the months after its publication, those people have been considerably less restrained in their private conversations than the paper itself was in its public presentation. Because what the data shows, when you look at it without the protective filters of academic caution, is something that does not have a good natural explanation. Something that is arranged the way things are arranged when something made a decision about where to put them. Something that runs through the most ancient, most protected, most geologically stable rock in the American Southwest in patterns that suggest purpose. What made something that purpose? When? How? Those questions are where the science currently ends and where the mystery begins. And that is where the oral traditions become not just interesting background context, but the closest thing we currently have to an answer. The Zuni people, whose traditional homeland stretches across what is now the border region between Arizona and New Mexico, have a different relationship with the Grand Canyon than the Hopi or the Havasupai, but a relationship that is no less ancient and no less specific. In Zuni cosmology, the Grand Canyon is not primarily a place of emergence, though emergence plays a role in Zuni tradition as well. The Zuni understand the canyon primarily as a place of passage, a threshold, a boundary between what was and what is. Their oral tradition includes accounts of the ancestors traveling through passages beneath the canyon that they describe in terms that are remarkably consistent with the survey data, though of course the elders who carry these traditions have not read the survey data, and the researchers who collected the survey data have not, for the most part, read the Zuni oral traditions. The Zuni word for the underground pathways is a term that their linguists translate as the road that the feet remember. It is a phrase that, in the context of Zuni ceremonial language, refers specifically to a kind of memory that is not in the mind but in the body, a knowledge of a path that is retained not as a conscious recollection but as a physical orientation, the way your feet know where the steps are in your own house, even when it's dark. The road that the feet remember is a path that the ancestors traveled so many times, across so many generations, that the knowledge of it became embodied rather than intellectual. It became something that was passed down not through teaching but through walking, through the accumulated cellular memory of bodies that had traveled the same route for so long that the route itself became part of the inheritance. The Zuni accounts describe the underground road as running from a point near the canyon that they identify in terms of natural landmarks, toward the northeast, toward the region of their traditional homeland. They describe it as having been used for ceremonial purposes during specific times of the year, when certain stars were in certain positions, when certain plants were blooming or dormant, when the river was running at certain levels. They describe it as having entrances that were known to the clan leaders and maintained by specific families whose responsibility across generations was to keep the knowledge of those entrances alive and to ensure that the entrances themselves remained accessible. They describe the interior of the passage not as a natural cave, rough and irregular and shaped by water, but as something more worked, more intentional, with walls that in some sections showed evidence of having been shaped by hands. That last detail is the one that has made the researchers who have heard it most uncomfortable and most interested. Because if the void spaces detected by the survey show evidence of human modification, the question of when that modification occurred becomes one of the most important questions in North American archaeology. The basement rock of the Grand Canyon, the Vishnu schist, and the Zoroaster granite at the very bottom of the geological column is between 1.7 and 1.8 billion years old. No human being modified that rock 1.7 billion years ago, but the void spaces detected by the survey are not necessarily in the basement rock. The survey data shows the anomalous features occurring primarily in the Cambrian and Precambrian sedimentary layers above the basement, layers that are still extraordinarily old by any human measure, but not so old that human presence becomes a geological impossibility. The question of when the first humans arrived in the Grand Canyon region and when they first developed the capacity and the motivation to do something as technically challenging as creating passages through solid rock is a question that the current survey data alone cannot answer. But the Navajo oral tradition has something to say about that question. And what it has to say is the part of this story that keeps me up at night more than anything else I've found in the research on this subject. The Navajo, the Dine as they call themselves, have a complex and layered relationship with the Grand Canyon that reflects the complexity of their history in the Southwest. Unlike the Hopi and the Havasupai, who have been in the canyon region since before the beginning of their traceable oral historical record, the Navajo arrived in the Southwest relatively recently. In the context of the deep timeline we're working with, linguistically, The Navajo language is related to the languages of the Athabascan peoples of Canada and Alaska, which means the ancestors of the Navajo people migrated south from the subarctic at some point in the past, probably between 500 and 1,000 years before European contact. When they arrived in the southwest, they encountered a landscape that was already ancient beyond anything in their previous experience. And they encountered the oral traditions of the peoples already living there, traditions that spoke of a time before the Navajo's own ancestors had arrived. The Navajo oral tradition about the Grand Canyon is therefore unusual in that it is, in part, a tradition about inheriting knowledge of a place rather than originating from it. The Navajo accounts of the underground passages beneath the canyon draw partly on their own observations and partly on knowledge they received from the Pueblo peoples they encountered when they arrived in the southwest. This makes those accounts particularly interesting to researchers because they represent a kind of synthesis, a meeting point between different traditions that converged on the same description of the same features from different directions. The Navajo term for what lies beneath the canyon is translated by their scholars as the Underworld Road, or the Road of Those Who Came Before. In their oral tradition, this road is not a metaphor for the journey of the soul or a spiritual concept about the path of life. It is described in terms that are as specific and practical as a trail description given by a guide who has walked the route. The accounts describe the depth of the passages, the materials of the walls, the points at which the passages intersect or branch, the features that mark the boundaries between one section and the next. They describe the underground road as having been made, not grown, as having been shaped by the people who used it, improved over generations, maintained by communities whose connection to it was both practical and sacred. The Navajo accounts also contain something that appears in none of the other traditions quite so directly, an account of what the underground road was for, not just in the general sense of passage or connection or ceremonial use, but in a specific, logistical sense. The accounts describe the passages beneath the Grand Canyon as having functioned as a kind of protected route, a way of moving people and materials through the canyon without being exposed to the dangers of the canyon's surface. This would have been enormously significant in a landscape where the canyon itself was simultaneously the most important geographic feature in the region and one of the most dangerous. The walls of the Grand Canyon kill people even today, with modern equipment and organized rescue services and helicopters. For a pre-Columbian people moving through that landscape on foot, the ability to bypass the most dangerous sections of the canyon surface through underground routes would have been not just convenient, but potentially the difference between the survival and extinction of entire communities. The Navajo accounts also reference, and this is the detail that has attracted the most attention from the researchers who have encountered it, a time before the accounts, a time that the Navajo oral tradition does not claim to have direct knowledge of, but acknowledges as a prior era from which the underground road itself comes. They describe the road as older than their own tradition, older than the Pueblo traditions they received partial knowledge from. They describe it as something they found when they arrived, something that was already old when it was first encountered by the people old enough to be old themselves. When their scholars press on this point, when they ask how old, the answer that comes back from the ceremonial knowledge keepers is the kind of answer that is technically a non-answer, but is actually more informative than any number could be. Older than the canyon, some say, which is impossible in geological terms, because nothing is older than the canyon's own rock. But what it means in the context of indigenous temporal language is older than we can usefully count, older than our own memory, from before the time our memory begins. That phrase, from before the time our memory begins, is the kind of thing that a historian trained in Western traditions hears as a signal that they have reached the edge of useful information. It is the point at which the oral record runs out and the speculation begins. But a researcher trained in indigenous epistemology, in the way that oral traditions work and what they preserve and how they encode information that would otherwise be lost, that researcher hears something different. They hear a marker, a timestamp placed at the boundary of reliable transmission. They hear people saying, "We know what we know, and beyond this point we are telling you what we received, not what we remember." and what we received was already described as ancient. And that is information. That is actually very precise information, encoded in the only form available to people who did not write things down, but who needed to convey to their descendants the degree to which something was beyond the horizon of living memory. What lies beyond the horizon of Navajo living memory, in the context of their oral tradition, is something that predates their arrival in the Southwest by an unknown but significant amount of time. And what predates their arrival in the Southwest by a significant amount of time, in the context of human habitation of the Grand Canyon region, is the culture that archaeologists call the ancestral Puebloans, or by the older and now contested term Anasazi, and before them the Kohanina people, and before them the desert archaic culture, and before them, going back into the deepest layers of human presence in the canyon, the Paleo-Indian peoples who walked the rim of a canyon that was 12 to 13,000 years ago, considerably different from the canyon that exists today, wetter and cooler, and surrounded by a landscape that has no modern analogue anywhere in North America. And here is where the story, which has been moving steadily in one direction, turns and opens up in a way that changes everything that came before it. Because the 1909 account, the one I mentioned at the beginning, the one that was published and then almost entirely buried, does not describe a mystery about what might be down there. It describes a discovery. It describes specific things found in specific places. And those things, if the account is accurate, change not just the story of the Grand Canyon but the story of North America. On the 5th of April, 1909, the Arizona Gazette, a daily newspaper published in Phoenix, ran a front-page story under the headline, "Explorations in Grand Canyon. Remarkable finds indicate ancient civilization under Arizona." The story described an expedition conducted under the auspices of the Smithsonian Institution, led by a man named G.E. Kincaid, who the article described as a government explorer and archaeologist, and supervised by a professor named S.A. Jordan, who the article identified as being associated with the Smithsonian. The article described the discovery of a cave system in the canyon, accessed through an entrance located approximately 1,400 feet below the canyon rim on the wall of the canyon, approximately 42 miles up the Colorado River from El Tovar, which would place it in a section of the canyon that is remote and difficult to access even today. What Kincaid and Jordan described finding inside this cave system, according to the Arizona Gazette account, was not a natural cave. It was a series of passages and chambers that appeared to have been constructed, or at minimum extensively modified, for habitation and ritual use. The account described granaries cut into the rock, the kind of storage chambers associated with ancestral Puebloan sites throughout the Southwest. It described a main corridor from which subsidiary passages branched off at regular intervals. It described a large central chamber, approximately an acre in extent, in which hundreds of mummified remains were found, along with artifacts that the article described as being of Egyptian or Oriental character. That last detail, the Egyptian or Oriental character of the artifacts, is the detail that has caused the most trouble for the serious investigation of this account. Because the idea that ancient Egyptians or ancient Asians traveled to the Grand Canyon and built an underground complex there is, to put it mildly, not well supported by the mainstream archaeological record, and it tends to attract a particular kind of speculative attention that does not help the credibility of the underlying questions. But I want to ask you to hold that detail loosely for a moment and pay attention to the rest of the description, because the rest of the description is considerably more interesting and considerably less implausible than the artifact question, and it is the rest of the description that lines up in remarkable ways with what the new scans are showing. Kincaid described the passages as running in both horizontal and vertical directions. He described the main corridor as being large enough for groups of people to move through comfortably. He described the walls of the passages in sections as showing evidence of having been worked by hand. He described the system as extending further into the canyon than the portion he was able to explore, with passages running off into the rock that he was unable to follow because of the darkness and the limitations of the lighting equipment available to the expedition in 1909. He described the overall impression of the system as one of scale, as something much larger than it appeared from any single vantage point inside it, something that implied extensive vertical and horizontal reach into the surrounding rock. The Smithsonian Institution, when contacted by journalists and researchers over the past century, has consistently denied any knowledge of the Kincaid expedition. They deny that anyone named G.E. Kincaid was ever on their staff or conducted any survey under their auspices. They deny that anyone named S.A. Jordan was associated with the institution in any capacity related to Grand Canyon research. They deny that any artifacts of the kind described in the 1909 article were ever received by the Smithsonian from the Grand Canyon region. This consistent denial has been interpreted in two very different ways by the people who have looked into the story. Some interpret it as evidence that the 1909 article was simply fabricated, that the Arizona Gazette printed a sensationalized story invented by an unscrupulous journalist. Others interpret the denial as exactly what you would expect from an institution that found something it didn't know what to do with, and decided, for reasons that might have been institutional, political, or genuinely scientific, to remove it from the public record. I cannot tell you which interpretation is correct. No one currently can. The records that would settle the question, if they exist, are not publicly accessible. The cave entrance that Kincaid described has not been definitively located by any subsequent expedition. The section of the canyon where the discovery was supposed to have taken place is restricted by the National Park Service, which controls all access to the canyon, to anyone who cannot demonstrate a specific scientific purpose that justifies the risk and the expense of reaching it. That restriction, in itself, proves nothing. The Grand Canyon is dangerous, and restricting access to its most remote sections is straightforwardly reasonable from a safety management perspective. But the restriction does mean that the most direct way of investigating the 1909 account, which would be to go to the location described and look, is not available to independent researchers. What is available is the scan data. And the scan data shows something in approximately the region where Kincaid described his discovery. The match is not precise, partly because the 1909 description is not precise enough to establish an exact location, and partly because the scan data covers the region in question at a resolution that, while impressive, cannot definitively identify a specific entrance to a specific passage from above. But the anomalous subsurface void structures that the survey detected in the eastern section of the canyon corridor, the section that corresponds most closely to Kincaid's stated location of 42 miles up the river from El Tovar, are among the largest and most distinctly linear features in the entire dataset. They are the features that prompted the most discussion among the research team. They are the features that the paper's language about non-random spatial organization is most clearly directed at. There is a researcher. I'm not going to use her name because she has not publicly connected her work to this story, and doing so without her permission would be inappropriate. But there is a researcher at a Western university who has been spending the past 3 years working on the intersection of the scan data, the Kincaid account, and the indigenous oral traditions. She has been conducting this research quietly, outside the mainstream of her department's priorities, using her own time and her own resources, because the combination of subjects she is working with is the kind of combination that tends to end careers if it is approached carelessly. She is approaching it carefully. She has been meeting with Hopi and Zuni and Navajo knowledge keepers, not to extract information but to build relationships. And in some cases, those relationships have begun to yield conversations about specific locations, specific features, specific details of the oral traditions that are not publicly known and that have not been shared with outside researchers before. She told me, in a conversation that I'm summarizing here with her knowledge and her agreement, that the thing that struck her most in those conversations was not the specific geographic information, though that information is significant. What struck her most was the consistency of the emotional register in which the elders described the underground passages. They were not describing a mystery. They were not describing something unknown or frightening or beyond their understanding. They were describing something familiar, something that their people knew, something that had been part of their world for so long that it had the quality of background knowledge. The kind of knowledge you don't think about very much because it's simply there, the way you know the layout of your own neighborhood without thinking about it. The underground passages beneath the Grand Canyon were not, in the accounts of the people whose traditions include them, something exotic or remarkable. They were part of the landscape. They were part of the geography of a world that those people understood in ways that the people who built the instruments scanning that geography from above do not yet understand. That is the gap this story is really about. Not the gap between what the scans show and what the geology books say should be there, though that gap is real and significant. The real gap is between two different kinds of knowing, two different relationships with a place, two different timescales of attention and memory. The people who have been living in and around the Grand Canyon for thousands of years have been paying attention for thousands of years. They have been accumulating observations across generations in ways that are different from scientific data collection but are not less rigorous, not less detailed, and not less accurate, as far as anyone can currently determine, about the features they describe. The people who built the instruments have been paying attention for, at most, a few decades, using tools that are extraordinarily sensitive and extraordinarily powerful, but that are also new to this place, new to this question, and working with a frame of reference that was built for a different context and a different set of expectations. The story of what lies beneath the Grand Canyon is, in part, a story about what happens when those two kinds of attention finally meet. When the long, patient, accumulated knowledge of people who have lived with a place for centuries starts being confirmed, in the specific technical language of geophysical survey data, by instruments that were built to answer very different questions. What happens, it turns out, is that everyone involved gets very quiet, because the implications are very large, and nobody, not the scientists with their scan data and their peer-reviewed papers, and not the elders with their oral traditions and their ceremonial knowledge, and not the historians and the archaeologists and the independent researchers who have been tracking the edges of this story for years. Nobody quite knows what to do with something this big. Let me tell you about the geology more specifically, because the geology is where the physical evidence lives, and the physical evidence is what makes this more than a story about interesting coincidences between indigenous oral traditions and speculative historical accounts. The rock of the Grand Canyon tells the history of the Earth in a way that is almost unbearably clear if you know how to read it. The youngest rock at the top of the canyon, the Kaibab limestone that you walk on when you stand at the rim, was deposited about 270 million years ago, when the region that is now the arid American Southwest was covered by a shallow tropical sea. Below that is the Torowep Formation, slightly older. Below that, the Coconino Sandstone, its cross-bedded layers the preserved record of ancient sand dunes. And so it goes. Down through the Hermit Formation and the Supai Group and the Redwall Limestone, each layer a chapter in the Earth's autobiography, until you reach the Tonto Platform and the Cambrian Age Bright Angel Shale and Tapeat Sandstone at the bottom of the visible geological column, laid down about 500 million years ago. Below the Tapeat Sandstone, there is a gap. Not a physical gap, not an absence of rock, but a gap in time so large that geologists gave it a name. They call it the Great Unconformity. It is the place where 500 million year old rock sits directly on top of rock that is nearly 2 billion years old. 500 million years of geological history, 500 million years of rock that should be there, is simply absent. The layers that should exist between the Cambrian sediments and the Precambrian basement rock were deposited, and then they were eroded away, and then the Cambrian sea deposited new layers on top of the erosion surface. This is a known geological phenomenon. The Great Unconformity at the Grand Canyon has been studied extensively, and its origins, while still not completely understood, are not considered mysterious in the scientific literature. But the anomalous void features detected by the survey are concentrated, disproportionately concentrated, in the rock just above the Great Unconformity, in the layers of Cambrian Age sedimentary rock that were deposited on top of that ancient erosion surface. This is notable for two reasons. First, because those Cambrian sedimentary rocks, primarily the Tapete sandstone and the Bright Angel shale, are the most structurally consistent, most uniformly deposited, and most geologically predictable rocks in the canyon sequence. They are the last rocks in which you would expect to find large, organized, linear void structures if those structures were the result of normal geological processes. They are rocks that, by their nature and their depositional history, should not contain the kind of features the survey is detecting. The second reason is more speculative but more interesting. The Great Unconformity itself, that boundary surface where the Cambrian Sea met the ancient Precambrian landscape that had been eroded down to nearly flat, was not a uniform surface. It was the surface of an ancient landscape, and ancient landscapes are not flat. They have topographic relief. They have features, and in some sections of the canyon, the Precambrian surface that the Cambrian Sea covered has features that are significantly more complex than the simple erosion surface described in the standard geological account. Features that some researchers have described, carefully and with appropriate hedging, as being inconsistent with purely erosional origins. Features that appear, in the scan data, to connect to the void structures above them in ways that suggest a relationship between the two. This is where the geology becomes genuinely uncertain. Not uncertain in the sense that the researchers are confused about their instruments or their data. Uncertain in the sense that the data is showing something that the existing models don't account for. And the existing models are what you use when you try to explain what you're seeing. And when the models don't fit, you have a problem. A good problem. The kind of problem that drives science forward, but a problem. The team that conducted the survey is currently working on a follow-up paper that will attempt to address this question more directly, to lay out the range of possible geological explanations for the anomalous features and evaluate the evidence for each one. That paper has not yet been published. What has been shared in conference presentations and in the informal conversations that happen between researchers who trust each other is the conclusion that the most straightforward geological explanations, the ones involving dissolution of soluble rock layers, or drainage of ancient water from porous formations, or the collapse of buried cave systems formed during wetter periods of the canyon's climate history. None of those explanations adequately account for the specific characteristics of what the survey found. They don't account for the linearity. They don't account for the regularity of the spacing between features. They don't account for the way the features appear to connect to each other in a coherent pattern rather than clustering randomly or following the paths that water would take through fractured rock. The explanation that accounts for those characteristics most naturally is one that the researchers are not yet in a position to argue for in print. It is the explanation that the Hopi elders and the Havasupai elders and the Zuni knowledge keepers and the Navajo ceremonial leaders have been offering for as long as anyone has thought to ask them. The explanation that something made these passages on purpose, that they were shaped by intention, that they are, in the fullest sense of the word, constructed. The question of who constructed them, and when, and how, is the question that the scan data alone cannot answer. To answer that question, you would need to get inside the passages. You would need to see the walls up close, to look for the marks of tools, to collect samples of any material that might be datable, to map the internal geometry of the system in a way that could be compared to known human-made underground structures from other parts of the world. You would need access to the passages themselves. The National Park Service has not, to date, issued any permit for a ground-level investigation of the anomalous features detected by the survey. This is not necessarily a conspiracy. The National Park Service operates under a set of mandates and constraints that make it genuinely difficult to approve speculative research expeditions into the most remote and dangerous sections of an already dangerous environment. The permits that have been submitted, and several researchers in this field have submitted permit applications in the past 2 years, have been received and reviewed and have not been approved, with explanations citing safety concerns, insufficient scientific justification, and the need for consultation with affiliated Native American tribes before any ground-level investigation of potential archaeological or cultural sites could proceed. That last requirement, the tribal consultation, is the one that interests me most, because it suggests that at some level of the approval process, someone recognized that the features detected by the survey might be connected to the cultural heritage of the indigenous peoples of the region. And it suggests that the question of what to do with this information, how to investigate it, who has the right to investigate it, and what framework should govern the investigation, is being treated as a question that cannot be answered without the participation of the communities whose knowledge of those features predates the survey by many generations. That seems right to me. That seems like the appropriate response to a situation this complex and this layered. But it also means that the investigation, such as it is moving slowly, much more slowly than the rate at which the questions are accumulating. There is a broader context for this story that I want to spend some time on, because the Grand Canyon is not unique in being the site of this kind of intersection between ancient oral tradition and modern geophysical survey data. It is the most dramatic and the most visible example, partly because of the sheer scale of the canyon, and partly because of the density and the specificity of the indigenous traditions that relate to it. But it is not the only place where this kind of alignment is occurring. And understanding the broader pattern helps clarify what might be happening beneath the canyon. Across the American Southwest, and more broadly across North America, there is a growing body of survey data suggesting that the subsurface of the continent is considerably more complex than the standard geological models anticipated. LiDAR surveys, which use airborne laser scanning to create extremely detailed topographical maps of landscapes, have been revealing the outlines of structures and earthworks that are invisible at ground level and that represent a scale of human landscape modification that was not previously understood to have occurred in pre-Columbian North America. The Maya lowlands of Central America have received the most attention for this kind of discovery, where LiDAR surveys have revealed that the classic Maya civilization was considerably larger and more densely settled than archaeologists had previously estimated, with a built landscape of cities and roads and agricultural modifications that rivaled anything in the contemporary Old World. But similar, if less dramatic, findings have been emerging from surveys conducted in the eastern woodlands of North America, in the Mississippi Valley, in the Great Basin, and in the Southwest. The ancestral Puebloan road system, which connects the great houses of Chaco Canyon to outlying communities across an area of nearly 60,000 square miles, is one example. The Chaco roads were not discovered through LiDAR. They were discovered through aerial photography in the mid-20th century, but their full extent and their engineering sophistication have been much better understood through subsequent remote sensing surveys. The roads are remarkable not just for their extent but for their precision. They are straight, genuinely straight, in the way that requires careful measurement and planning to achieve, not approximately straight the way a path worn by repeated foot traffic tends to be approximately straight. They ignore topographic obstacles, going over hills and across ravines instead of around them, in the way that things go when they are made according to a plan rather than according to the path of least resistance. That kind of engineering, the kind that imposes geometric order on an irregular landscape, is the kind of engineering that the anomalous subsurface features beneath the Grand Canyon suggest in their spatial organization. The linearity that the survey team described, the regularity of spacing, the pattern of connections, those are characteristics of engineered systems. They are not characteristics of natural geological processes. They are characteristics of things that were made. The question of what the ancestral Puebloans were capable of engineering and what they actually built in the centuries before European contact is a question that archaeology has been revising steadily upward in its estimates over the past several decades. Chaco Canyon, at its height between approximately 850 and 1,150 CE, was the center of a regional system that coordinated the movement of goods, people, and ceremonial knowledge across an area larger than most European countries of the same period. The great houses of Chaco, buildings of 4 and 5 stories constructed with a precision of stonework that modern masons have described as extraordinary, required the transport of hundreds of thousands of timber beams from forests that were, in some cases, 50 miles or more from the construction site. They required a labor force and a logistical system capable of organizing and sustaining large-scale construction projects over periods of decades. The people who built Chaco were not primitive. They were sophisticated, they were organized, they had engineering knowledge, logistical capacity, and long-distance communication and coordination abilities that were, in some respects, comparable to what was being achieved in the Old World at the same time. The question of what else those people built, what projects they undertook that did not survive in the archaeological record as visibly as the great houses of Chaco, is a question that the scan data is now making urgent in a new way. The connection between Chaco Canyon and the Grand Canyon is not just geographic, though geographically they are relatively close in the scale of things. The connection is also cultural and historical. The ancestral Puebloan system centered at Chaco drew people and resources from across the southwest, and the Grand Canyon region was within the sphere of Chacoan influence. Artifacts of Chacoan manufacture have been found in the canyon region. The road system of the Chacoan network appears to have extended toward the canyon in ways that have not been fully mapped, but that suggests the canyon was not simply a barrier or an obstacle in the Chacoan world, but something more significant, something worth building toward, something worth maintaining connection with. The Hopi people, whose relationship to the Chacoan world is still debated among archaeologists, but who maintain in their own oral tradition that their ancestors participated in the great flowering of ancestral Puebloan civilization, describe the road to the Sipapu as one of the most important routes in their ancestral geography. They describe it as a pilgrimage road, a road that people traveled at specific times of the year for specific ceremonial purposes, a road that ended not at a destination in the ordinary sense, but at a threshold. At the entrance to the world below, the Sipapu, the passage through which the ancestors came up, and through which, in the Hopi understanding of the cosmos, the connection to the worlds below continues to be maintained. That is not a geological description, it is a cosmological one, but it describes something geographically specific, something in a particular place, something that can, in principle, be located and examined, and the new scan data is now suggesting that in the rock below the Grand Canyon there is something physically consistent with what that description implies. I want to be precise about what I mean and what I don't mean when I say that. I am not saying that the Hopi cosmology is literally true in the sense that there are actually multiple worlds below the Earth, and that the canyon is an opening between them. What I am saying is that the Hopi description of a specific geographic feature, a passage through the rock in a specific region of the canyon, a passage large enough for human beings to move through, a passage that was known and used by the ancestors, and that has specific characteristics that distinguish it from a natural cave, is consistent with what the survey data is detecting. I am saying that the oral tradition and the geophysical data are describing the same thing from different angles, in different vocabularies, across a gap of time and epistemology that is very large, and that they arrive at descriptions that overlap in ways that are too specific to be easily dismissed as coincidence. The researchers who are closest to this data, the ones who have both the technical training to understand what the instruments are showing and the intellectual flexibility to take the oral tradition seriously as a source of information rather than as mythology, to be politely acknowledged and then set aside, those researchers are in an uncomfortable place right now. They are holding two different kinds of evidence that are pointing in the same direction, and the direction they are pointing is toward a conclusion that will be extremely difficult to publish in a mainstream scientific journal because it requires admitting that the standard archaeological account of pre-Columbian North America is missing something important, something large, something that has been in plain sight, if you count the oral traditions of indigenous peoples as plain sight, for as long as those traditions have existed. The standard account says that the most complex, most organized, most technically ambitious human societies in pre-Columbian North America were the Mississippian cultures of the eastern United States, with Cahokia as their most prominent expression and the southwest cultures centered at Chaco Canyon. It says that these cultures, while impressive and sophisticated, did not achieve the kind of monumental underground engineering that the ancient Romans or the ancient Egyptians or the ancient Chinese achieved. It says that the deep subsurface of the Grand Canyon contains no evidence of human activity because humans did not have the means or the motivation to create significant features in the deep subsurface of a canyon that is itself already one of the most challenging environments in North America. The scan data is suggesting that the standard account may need revision, and the oral traditions of the peoples who have lived with this place for centuries are suggesting the same thing, in the only language available to them, which is the language of memory and story, and the accumulated knowledge of people who paid attention to the world around them, with an intensity and a continuity that the modern world has largely lost the capacity for. What would it mean if the passages are real? What would it mean if the scan data is showing what it appears to be showing, and if the oral traditions are describing what they appear to be describing, and if the 1,909 newspaper account, despite the Smithsonian's denials, is at least partially based on something that someone actually found? What would it mean for our understanding of North American prehistory, of the capacities of pre-Columbian peoples, of the relationship between the indigenous nations of the Southwest and the landscape they have inhabited for millennia? It would mean, first and most fundamentally, that the subsurface of the Grand Canyon is not the geologically simple space that the existing models assume. It would mean that there is structure down there, human-made structure, that has survived in the rock for a period of time that we cannot yet determine, but that might be very long, longer than the oldest known human occupation of the region, longer than the ancestral Puebloan period. Possibly, though this is the most speculative and the most difficult claim to evaluate, longer than the oldest dates currently associated with significant human activity in the American Southwest. It would mean, second, that the oral traditions of the Hopi and the Havasupai and the Zuni and the Navajo have been accurately preserving information about physical features of the landscape for a period of time that challenges our assumptions about the reliability and the longevity of oral transmission. The oral traditions that describe the underground passages are not recent additions to these cultures' knowledge systems. They are among the oldest and most deeply embedded elements of those traditions. They are connected to the most fundamental cosmological and ceremonial frameworks of those cultures. They are the kind of knowledge that is treated with the highest degree of care and the most rigorous protocols for preservation and transmission. The idea that those traditions have been accurately describing real physical features of the canyon landscape for hundreds or thousands of years is not inherently implausible. It is, in fact, consistent with what research on oral tradition in other cultural contexts has found. Oral traditions, when they are maintained with the kind of rigor and care that the traditions of these Southwest cultures are maintained with, can preserve accurate information about specific geographic features across time spans that challenge the assumptions of people trained to think of writing as the only reliable medium for long-term information storage. It would mean, third, that the history of scientific engagement with indigenous knowledge in the American Southwest, a history that includes systematic dismissal, deliberate suppression in some cases, and a pervasive assumption that the knowledge held by indigenous communities about their own landscapes was always inferior to the knowledge that outside researchers could generate, needs to be fundamentally reconsidered. The researchers who filed the accounts of Manakaja and the other Havasupai elders under mythology were making a decision about what kind of information counted as real information. They were deciding that the accumulated knowledge of people who had lived in the canyon for generations was less reliable, less valuable, and less worth taking seriously than the results of investigations conducted by outside experts with scientific instruments. The scan data is now suggesting that the elders who were dismissed as storytellers were describing the same features that the instruments are detecting. That should prompt a rethinking not just of this specific case, but of the entire framework of assumptions that govern the engagement. And it would mean, fourth, that the Grand Canyon is not finished surprising us, not by a long way. The canyon that the tourists see from the rim, the canyon that has been photographed and painted and written about and studied for 150 years, is only the surface of a place that goes much deeper. in every sense of that phrase, than the surface suggests. The canyon that the Hopi and the Havasupai and the Zuni and the Navajo know, the canyon that their traditions describe and their ceremonial life reflects, is a more layered and more complex place than the geological survey maps have shown. It is a place with history that goes back further than the history books have reached. It is a place with structure that the instruments are only now beginning to detect. It is a place with a relationship to the people who have called it home that is not captured in any scientific paper or Park Service interpretive display, but that is preserved carefully and precisely in the living memory of communities that have never stopped paying attention. I find myself returning again and again to the image of the handprint. If you have ever been to a site where ancient rock art is preserved, you know the image I mean. The hand pressed flat against the stone, the pigment blown around it, the negative space where the hand was, the simple human mark that says, I was here, I existed. I was in this place and I pressed my hand against this stone, and I am telling you, across whatever distance of time separates us, that I was here. There are handprints in the Grand Canyon, not many compared to some other sites in the Southwest, but there are places in the canyon walls where the ochre marks of ancient hands are still visible, still carrying that message across the centuries. The people who left those marks knew something that we are only now beginning to measure. They knew the canyon from the inside out. They knew its surface and its subsurface, its visible walls and whatever lies behind those walls, its daily rhythms and its deep time structure. They knew it the way you know a place when you have lived there for your entire life, and your parents lived there for their entire lives, and their parents before them for as far back as the memory of the community extends. They knew it in the way that you cannot know something from a survey pass in an airplane or a week-long rafting trip or a paper published in a geology journal. They knew it because they were part of it, because the relationship between their communities and that place was not the relationship of observer to observed, but the relationship of inhabitant to home. The handprints say, we were here. The oral traditions say, we knew what was here. The scan data is beginning to say, there is something here that we did not expect. And the gap between those three statements is the story we are still in the middle of. There are practical questions that need to be answered, and they will be answered, eventually, through the combination of continued remote sensing, negotiated ground-level access, when the consultation process with the affiliated tribes has been completed appropriately, and the kind of slow, careful, methodologically rigorous work that good archaeology requires. Those questions are, what exactly are the void structures that the survey detected? Are they natural or modified or constructed? What is their age? Do they contain any materials, organic or inorganic, that could be dated or analyzed? Are they connected to any known above-ground archaeological sites in the canyon or in the surrounding region? Do they correspond in their specific locations to the geographic descriptions in the oral traditions? And if so, how precisely? Those questions will take years to answer. The permit process alone, done correctly, with appropriate tribal consultation at every stage, will take time. The ground-level survey, when it is finally authorized, will be technically challenging and expensive and slow. The analysis of whatever is found, if anything is found, will require specialists from multiple disciplines working together. This is not a story that will be resolved in a single headline or a single paper or a single news cycle. It is the kind of story that takes the kind of time that the canyon itself takes. Deep time, slow time, the time required to do something that actually matters with appropriate care. But the questions are out there now. The scan data exists. The oral traditions have been recorded and are available. The 1909 account, whatever its ultimate status as historical document, has been preserved. The growing body of research on the capacities of pre-Columbian North American civilizations is accumulating and revising the standard account in ways that make the Grand Canyon findings less surprising, not more. With each passing year, the pieces of this story are all present. They are assembling themselves, slowly, in the careful and uncertain way that truth assembles itself when it is being approached with honesty and rigor, rather than with the need to reach a conclusion quickly or to confirm what was already assumed. And the canyon itself is patient. The canyon is very, very patient. It has been keeping these secrets, or these facts, or these features, or whatever we ultimately decide to call them, for a very long time. It will keep them a little longer, while the humans who are now paying attention with their instruments and their oral traditions and their journal papers and their permit applications work out what to do next. I think about the Havasupai elder Manakaja, whose words were written down so carefully and then filed away. I think about what it was like to be him, to know with the specific, grounded certainty of someone who has lived in a place all their life, that there was something beneath the canyon that the outsiders who came and asked their questions and took their notes could not quite bring themselves to take seriously. I think about what it cost him, or didn't cost him, to say what he knew anyway, to put it into the record even knowing it would be set aside, to offer the truth of his community's knowledge to ears that were not yet ready to hear it. His words have been sitting in the Smithsonian archive for over a century. They are still there, and the instruments have caught up with them. Not all the way, not yet, but they are catching up. The canyon is a mile deep and 277 miles long, and it holds 2 billion years of the Earth's memory in its walls. And below those walls, below the great unconformity where the Cambrian Sea met the ancient eroded landscape, below the basement rock that is older than complex life, the scan data is showing something that the instruments were not designed to find, and that the oral traditions have been pointing toward for as long as anyone in the scientific tradition has been paying attention. Something is down there. The elders knew. The ancestors knew, through whatever means of knowing was available to them, through observation and experience, and the accumulated attention of generations. The instruments are beginning to know, and eventually the rest of us will know too. In the meantime, the canyon keeps its silence. The river keeps running at the bottom, that green thread of water patient beyond any human patience, doing its work, cutting its way through the stone, revealing one layer at a time what has always been there waiting for someone to look closely enough. The stars above the canyon rim are the same stars that the Hopi and the Havasupai and the Zuni and the Navajo have been reading for millennia. The same stars that tell the ceremonial calendar, that mark the times for pilgrimage, that align with the passages in the landscape and the passages in the story and the passages beneath the ground, where the ancestors traveled and the instruments are now listening. What we know is this: the scans found something. The oral traditions describe something consistent with what the scans found. The history of engagement between outside researchers and indigenous knowledge in the American Southwest is a history of systematic underestimation of that knowledge, and the canyon is deeper than it looks. What we don't know is what exactly is down there, how old it is, who made it, if it was made, what it was for, whether the passages connect to each other in the way the oral traditions describe, whether the system, if it is a system, extends beyond the sections covered by the survey, whether there is anything inside it that could tell us the answers to those questions, whether the answers, when they come, will change what we thought we knew about the people who built the most ambitious and the most enduring civilization in pre-Columbian North America. Those unknowns are not a failure of the research. They are the research. They are the frontier. They are the place where the instruments stop and the next question begins. The Hopi word for the opening beneath the world is also, in the ceremonial kiva, the name for the hole in the floor that represents the connection to the worlds below. And the word the Havasupai use for the underground roads is also the word they use for the roads that the feet remember. And the Navajo describe what lies beneath the canyon as older than the canyon itself, which is geologically impossible and cosmologically precise. And the Zuni call it the Road of the Ancestors, which is both a geographic description and a statement of lineage, a claim of relationship to whatever made those passages and whatever they were for. All of those words point in the same direction, down, into the rock, into the ancient dark beneath a canyon that is already the oldest visible landscape in North America, into something that has been there, waiting, while the Cambrian Sea came and went, and the canyon cut its way through 2 billion years of stone, and the human record went from handprints and oral tradition to written language, an airborne electromagnetic survey and satellite imaging, and peer-reviewed journals and Park Service permit applications. Still there, still waiting, still keeping its silence while the attention of the surface world slowly, finally, begins to turn toward it with the right combination of instruments and humility and willingness to hear what has already been said. The new scans found a tunnel network beneath the Grand Canyon. That sentence will mean something different in 50 years than it means today, because in 50 years the questions it opens will have been pursued, and some of them will have been answered, and the answers will have changed the picture in ways we cannot currently predict. But tonight, in the present tense of what we currently know, that sentence is the beginning of a story that the canyon has been holding in its rock, and the elders have been holding in their memory, and the instruments have only just begun to hear. The beginning is enough for tonight. The canyon will still be there in the morning, the rock will still remember, the river will still be running, and the questions will still be waiting, patient as stone, deep as the place where the Cambrian meets the Precambrian, in that ancient boundary where 500 million years of history simply isn't there anymore, where something very large and very old is absent in a way that has no good natural explanation, and where the instruments are beginning to hear something that the elders have always known was there. Rest now, let the canyon be what it is in the dark, a mile deep, 277 miles long, 2 billion years old, and still, after all of that, still full of things it hasn't yet shown us. Let the sound of the river at the bottom be the sound that carries you towards sleep, the green thread of water doing its patient work, the walls of stone holding their memory, the passages, if they are passages, keeping their specific ancient silence in the rock, the stars above the rim turning on their old axes, the hands pressed against the stone saying what they always said. I was here, and what I knew was real. If this journey through the deep history of the Grand Canyon kept your mind gently wandering towards sleep, you can softly tap like so the algorithm knows to show you more stories like this one. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring the hidden chapters of American history and ancient mystery together, and I would love to know where in the world you're listening from right now. Leave a comment with your location and the time. A city, a country, a mountain, a coast, wherever you are when this voice finds you in the dark. For those who want to support this channel in a deeper way, there is an optional membership here on YouTube, completely without pressure, just a way to help keep these long, slow explorations coming. But watching and listening is more than enough. You don't need to do anything at all. Just let the canyon hold you for a little while longer and drift toward wherever the night takes you. There is a thing that happens when you spend a long time with a mystery. When you sit with it the way the Havasupai have sat with the mystery of the underground roads, the way the Hopi have sat with the question of what exactly the Sipapu is and where exactly it opens, the way the geophysicists who conducted the survey sat with data that wouldn't resolve into anything their training had prepared them for. The thing that happens is this: the mystery stops feeling like an absence and starts feeling like a presence. It stops feeling like something missing and starts feeling like something very much there, pressing against the edge of your understanding from the other side, making itself known not through what it reveals but through the specific shape of what it conceals. The Grand Canyon has that quality more than almost any place I have encountered in the research for this story. It is not a mystery because it is empty. It is not a mystery because nothing is known about it. It is a mystery precisely because so much is known about it, so precisely and for so long, and yet the totality of what is known still does not add up to an explanation for what the instruments are detecting in the rock below the river. The known and the unknown sit side by side in the canyon, the way the Cambrian and the Precambrian sit side by side at the Great Unconformity, separated by an absence that should not be there but is. That marks a gap in the record that no amount of additional study of what remains has yet managed to fill. I want to go back to the geology one more time, because there is a detail I passed over earlier that deserves more attention. The detail concerns the specific characteristics of the Tapeat sandstone, the lowest of the Cambrian Age sedimentary formations in the canyon, and the one that sits directly on top of the Great Unconformity. The Tapete Sandstone is a beach sand deposit. It was laid down approximately 520 million years ago along the shoreline of the Cambrian Sea. As that sea transgressed, moved inland over the ancient eroded Precambrian surface. It is, in the places where it is well preserved, a relatively uniform, relatively predictable sandstone, the kind of rock that geologists describe as well sorted, meaning the grain sizes are consistent, the bedding is regular, the overall structure of the formation is what you would expect from a beach deposit, laid down under stable conditions over a relatively long period of time. In the sections of the canyon where the survey detected the anomalous void features most prominently, the Tapete Sandstone is not behaving the way a uniform beach deposit should behave. The electrical conductivity readings that the airborne electromagnetic survey produced from those sections show variations that are not consistent with the expected properties of the formation. In some places, the conductivity is lower than it should be, which can indicate the presence of air-filled voids. In other places, it is higher than it should be, which can indicate the presence of water or, in some geological contexts, the presence of materials with different chemical compositions than the surrounding rock. The pattern of high and low conductivity readings, when mapped in 3 dimensions using the survey data, does not look like a natural distribution. It looks organized. It looks like something is in the rock that is different from the rock around it, and that something is arranged in a way that reflects intention rather than geology. The geophysicists who analyzed this data spent considerable time testing the hypothesis that the anomalous conductivity readings were artifacts of the survey method, interference effects from the canyon topography, ground effects from surface features that the processing algorithm had not correctly accounted for. They were not able to attribute the readings to any of those sources. The readings persisted through multiple reprocessing approaches and through comparison with control datasets from sections of the canyon where no anomalous features were expected and none were found. Whatever is producing the anomalous conductivity signature in the Tapete Sandstone sections, it is real in the sense that the instruments are detecting a genuine physical difference between those sections of rock and the surrounding formations. It is not an artifact. It is a signal. What the signal means is the question. The physical interpretation of the signal, the translation of conductivity variations into a picture of what is actually in the rock, requires making assumptions about the properties of the materials that might be present, and those assumptions shape the interpretation significantly. If you assume that the anomalous features are air-filled voids, you get one picture. If you assume they are water-saturated cavities, you get a different picture. If you allow for the possibility that they contain materials with unusual chemical or physical properties, materials that differ from both the surrounding sandstone and from simple air or water, you open a range of interpretations that the survey data alone cannot distinguish between. This is where the 1909 Kincaid account becomes relevant again, not as evidence for a specific interpretation but as a source of specific details that could help distinguish between interpretations if they could be verified. Kincaid described the walls of the passages in some sections as being covered with a substance that he compared to a patina, a mineral coating of the kind that forms on rock surfaces that have been exposed to air and to the activity of organisms over very long periods of time. He described the floors of some of the chambers as having a different composition from the walls, suggesting that different materials had accumulated there. He described objects made of materials that he could not immediately identify, materials that had the appearance of metals but that were lighter than the metals he was familiar with, and that had a surface quality he described as not quite metallic. None of these descriptions are detailed enough to draw firm conclusions from, but they are consistent with the description of spaces that have been enclosed for a very long time, spaces in which materials of various kinds have had centuries or millennia to interact with each other and with the environment of the enclosure. The conductivity anomalies in the survey data are consistent, in a general sense, with the presence of spaces that contain materials other than simple air. Whether those materials are the kind of residue left by long-term occupation or the products of geological processes or something else entirely is not something the survey data can determine. But the consistency between the data and the 1909 description, however uncertain and indirect that consistency is one more thread in a web of alignment that keeps building without anyone having planned it. I want to talk about the broader archaeological context more specifically now, because it matters for understanding what kind of thing the Grand Canyon passages, if they are passages, might represent. The American Southwest in the centuries before European contact was not the sparsely populated, technologically simple landscape that the earliest European accounts often described. It was a region of considerable complexity, significant population density in some areas, long-distance trade networks, sophisticated agricultural engineering, and architectural achievement that has never been fully appreciated, because the materials of pre-Columbian southwestern construction, adobe and sandstone, do not preserve as dramatically as the stone and concrete of old-world monumental architecture. The Hohokam people, whose agricultural civilization occupied the Salt and Gila River valleys of what is now southern Arizona for approximately 1,500 years, between roughly 300 CE and 1,450 CE, built a canal system that is one of the most impressive hydraulic engineering achievements in the pre-Columbian Americas. At its peak, the Hohokam Canal network comprised more than 500 miles of primary canals and an unknown but larger extent of secondary and tertiary distribution canals. These canals moved water from the rivers to agricultural fields across an area of several hundred square miles, supporting a population that archaeologists estimate at somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 people in the Phoenix Basin alone. The canals required sophisticated hydraulic engineering, precise calculation of gradient and flow rate, organized maintenance across a network too large for any single community to manage, and the coordination of labor from multiple communities across multiple decades of construction. The Hohokam were not a civilization that lacked engineering ambition or engineering capability. They were a civilization that applied those capabilities to the specific challenges and opportunities of their environment. And their environment, in the centuries of Hohokam fluorescence, included proximity to the Grand Canyon region and connection through trade networks to the cultures of the canyon and the plateau above it. The question of whether Hohokam engineering knowledge contributed to any subterranean works in the canyon region is speculative, but it is speculative in the context of a civilization that demonstrably possessed the technical capacity for large-scale, organized underground excavation. The Mogollon people, whose territory overlapped with both the ancestral Puebloan world to the north and the Hohokam world to the west, built pit houses and kivas of considerable sophistication, including some subterranean structures that were partly or entirely underground by design. The tradition of building below ground, of creating enclosed spaces within the earth rather than on its surface, is ancient in the Southwest. It is not limited to ceremonial structures, though the most visible surviving examples are the kivas that punctuate ancestral Puebloan sites across the Colorado Plateau. It reflects a relationship with the earth and with the underground that is woven through the cosmological and practical traditions of southwestern cultures in ways that make the idea of underground engineering at the Grand Canyon culturally plausible even before the geological survey data came along to make it physically evident. The question of scale is the one that gives pause. Building a kiva requires significant effort. Building a single underground chamber of the kind Kincaid described requires more. Building a network of passages extending through the deep rock beneath one of the most geologically complex and geographically challenging landscapes in North America requires something else entirely. Something that would represent an engineering achievement without clear parallel in the known archaeological record of the region. But the known archaeological record of the region has been revised dramatically upward in its estimates of pre-Columbian capability many times in the past 100 years, and each revision has followed the same pattern, a discovery of something more ambitious and more organized than what was previously known, followed by a period of skepticism, followed by the gradual accumulation of evidence that required updating the model. Chaco Canyon was not taken seriously as a major architectural and organizational achievement until the 20th century. The scale of the Hohokam Canal network was not fully understood until aerial photography became available. The extent of the ancestral pueblo and road system was not appreciated until remote sensing surveys revealed it. The deep prehistory of the Southwest, the Paleo-Indian and Desert Archaic periods before the emergence of the ceramic-making, village-building cultures that archaeologists have studied most intensively, is still very poorly understood, partly because the materials from those periods are fragile and do not preserve well, and partly because the research attention has been concentrated on later, more visible sites. What the survey data suggests is that the underground, which is by its nature even less accessible to conventional archaeological investigation than the surface, may contain evidence of human activity that predates the most intensively studied periods of southwestern prehistory by a significant margin. Not necessarily in the sense that the passages were created by people who lived 15,000 years ago, though that possibility cannot be ruled out on the current evidence, but in the sense that the structures, if they are structures, are old enough and large enough and organized enough to require a significant revision of the standard timeline of pre-Columbian engineering in North America. The Great Unconformity is the model I keep returning to, because it is the closest geological analog for what this story is describing at the level of knowledge and history. The Great Unconformity is a gap, a place where something should be and isn't, where 500 million years of geological record simply doesn't exist, where the stone that should encode that history was removed before the Cambrian Sea came and deposited the layers that sit on top of it now. The gap is real, the gap is measurable, the gap is undeniable. But what caused the gap, what removed that 500 million years of rock, is still debated. The most recent research suggests it may have been related to a global glaciation event so severe that the ice scoured the continents down to their ancient basement rock before retreating, but the details are still being worked out. The gap remains, precisely defined and still somewhat mysterious in its origins. The gap in the archaeological record, the absence of the story of what was built beneath the Grand Canyon and by whom and when and how and why, is a different kind of gap. It is a gap in the record, not in the rock. The rock, it turns out, may have been keeping the record all along, in the form of the features that the instruments are now detecting. The gap is in our attention, in our instruments, in our willingness to take seriously the testimonies of the people whose traditions have been describing those features for as long as their traditions have existed. Filling that gap is the project that is now beginning. It is a project that will require the cooperation of the geophysicists who conducted the survey and the archaeologists who can interpret what is found in a cultural context, and the historians who can trace the documentary record back, through the institutional silences to whatever lies on the other side of them, and the tribal representatives who must be not just consulted, but genuinely partnered with in any investigation of features that their communities have maintained a living relationship with across centuries of that relationship being ignored by the academic institutions that should have been listening. It is a project that will require patience, because the canyon itself demands patience, and the question of what lies beneath it demands more. But the project has begun. The data exists. The conversations are happening, some of them in offices and conference rooms, and some of them around fires in places that outside researchers are only beginning to be invited into. The permits are under review. The questions are being taken seriously for the first time by institutions that have the resources and the authority to pursue the answers in ways that individual researchers working outside the mainstream cannot. And the canyon waits, as it has always waited. As it waited while the Cambrian Sea deposited its layers on the eroded Precambrian surface. As it waited while the Colorado River spent 5 million years cutting its way down through those layers. As it waited while the Hopi and the Havasupai and the Zuni and the Navajo lived their lives in its shadow and its depths, and maintained the knowledge of what it contained in the most durable form available to human communities, which is the form of living memory transmitted through story and ceremony, and the accumulated attention of generations who understood that some things are worth knowing for a very long time. The river at the bottom of the canyon is running tonight. The Kaibab limestone at the rim is pale in whatever light reaches it. The walls in between hold their 2 billion years of memory in layers that you can read like a book if you know the language. And somewhere in the rock below the river, below the great unconformity, in the organized and linear void spaces that the instruments have been patiently mapping for 5 years, something is waiting to be understood. Not waiting in the way that mysterious things wait in stories, not with any quality of intention or awareness. Just waiting the way the earth waits, which is patiently and without urgency, and without any particular interest in whether the surface world eventually notices it or not. We noticed. That is the new thing. After a very long time of not noticing, or of noticing only in the ways that could be dismissed and filed under mythology, the instruments have given us a way of noticing that is harder to dismiss. And the instruments and the oral traditions and the archived accounts and the growing body of archaeological research are all pointing, from different angles and with different vocabularies and with different degrees of certainty, at the same place, at the passages beneath the stone, at the road that the feet remember, at the Sipapu, at the world below. I think about what it would feel like to be the first researcher to stand inside one of those passages, if they are passages, if the permits come through and the investigation moves forward and the entrance is located and the descent is made, to stand in that specific darkness surrounded by rock that is 500 million years old, and to put your hand against the wall and feel, if the oral traditions are right, if the 1909 account is right, if the scan data is pointing at what it appears to be pointing at, the texture of stone that was shaped by something other than the grinding of the Colorado River or the slow work of percolating water, to feel the specific intentionality of a surface that was prepared, to stand in a silence so complete that you could hear your own blood moving, what would you think? What would you feel? Standing in that specific darkness with that specific history pressing in from all sides, knowing that the Hopi elders had described this as the place of emergence, knowing that the Havasupai elder Manakaja had spoken of roads that the feet remember, knowing that the Navajo traditions called it the pathway between worlds, knowing that a journalist in 1909 had published an account of exactly this, of passages and chambers in the deep rock, and that the Smithsonian had denied any knowledge of it, and that the denial had been accepted, and the account filed away, and the location sealed by the administrative machinery of a national park whose mandate includes the protection of archaeological resources from unauthorized investigation. What would you think? I think you would feel, more than anything, the weight of the gap between what was known and what was recorded, between what was said and what was heard, between the knowledge held in the living memory of communities whose relationship with this place goes back further than any institution currently operating has existed, and the knowledge held in the peer-reviewed literature, the survey data, the permit applications, the institutional denials. That gap is not a geological feature. It is a human one. It was made not by the Colorado River or by the forces that formed the Great Unconformity, but by a series of decisions made by specific people in specific historical moments about what kinds of knowledge count and whose account of reality is worth taking seriously. Those decisions have consequences. They have consequences in the specific case of the Grand Canyon, where they produced a situation in which the most detailed and specific knowledge of a significant physical feature was held by the communities least likely to be consulted in the investigation of that feature. And they have consequences in the broader case of the relationship between Western scientific institutions and the indigenous knowledge systems of the peoples. Those institutions studied and documented and systematically underestimated for a century and a half. The scan data is an opportunity to do something different, to treat the alignment between the survey results and the oral traditions as what it appears to be, which is two independent and very different knowledge systems converging on an accurate description of the same physical feature, and to use that convergence as the basis for an investigation that takes both systems seriously and gives both communities, the scientific community and the indigenous communities, genuine standing in the investigation. That is the opportunity. Whether it will be taken is a question that will be answered not by the canyon but by the people and the institutions currently making decisions about how to proceed. Let me tell you about one more thing before the night gets too deep and the weight of it all becomes too much for the particular kind of listening that works best in the hour before sleep. Let me tell you about what the research on long-term oral tradition preservation has to say about the reliability of the knowledge systems that have been describing these passages for as long as anyone has asked. The anthropologist Patrick Nunn and the linguist Nicholas Reed published research in 2016 demonstrating that Aboriginal Australian oral traditions accurately preserved memory of sea level rise events that occurred more than 7,000 years ago, when the end of the last ice age melted enough glacial ice to raise sea levels by as much as 400 feet in some coastal regions. The oral traditions they studied described specific coastal geography, named locations, specific features of the landscape that had existed before the sea level rise and that were now underwater. When Nunn and Reed investigated the geological and coastal geography records, they found that the oral tradition descriptions were accurate. They were describing real places, real features, real events that had happened 7,000 to 12,000 years ago, preserved in living memory, transmitted across hundreds of generations through ceremony and story, and the specific mnemonic techniques of oral tradition that create extraordinary durability in the information being transmitted. 7,000 years, hundreds of generations, information about specific geographic features of a landscape that no living person had seen and that existed only in the geological record and in the oral tradition. And the oral tradition had it right. The implications for the Grand Canyon oral traditions are significant. If Aboriginal Australian traditions can accurately preserve geographic information across 7,000 years of transmission, then there is no a priori reason to doubt that the Hopi and Havasupai and Zuni and Navajo traditions about the underground passages could be accurately preserving information about features that those traditions have been describing for whatever period of time those traditions reach back into. The question of how far back those traditions reach is genuinely uncertain. The Hopi have been living in the Colorado Plateau region for at least 2,000 years by the most conservative archaeological estimates, and their own account of their presence in the region extends much further. The Havasupai have been in the canyon itself for at least 800 years by conservative estimates, and their oral tradition refers to a time before their memory begins that implies even greater depth. The oral tradition goes back further than the archaeology can currently verify, but that gap between the verifiable and the tradition is exactly the kind of gap that the Australian research suggests we should not fill with skepticism by default. The specific nature of the information preserved in these traditions matters too. The traditions are not vague. They are not describing a general sense of something underground or a spiritual concept of an underworld. They are describing specific features, the depth of the passages, the direction they run, the materials of the walls, the points at which they connect to each other, the specific entrances, the specific purposes for which they were used. That level of specificity is a marker of accurate transmission in oral tradition research. Vague, general, symbolic content tends to drift over generations of transmission. Specific, concrete geographic content that people have reasons to keep accurate because their lives or their ceremonies depend on its accuracy, tends to be preserved with remarkable fidelity. The ceremonies that the Hopi and the Havasupai and the Zuni and the Navajo conducted in relation to the underground passages, the pilgrimages and the rituals and the knowledge transmissions that were organized around the passages, those ceremonies were the mechanism for preserving the specific knowledge of the passages accurately across generations. The ceremonies created the social and institutional context in which the knowledge was transmitted carefully, in which errors of transmission were caught and corrected, in which the information was reinforced repeatedly rather than told once and left to drift. As long as the ceremonies continued, the specific knowledge they carried continued. And the ceremonies continued, in various forms and with various disruptions caused by the pressures of colonization and the suppression of indigenous ceremonial life. That was a deliberate policy of the American government for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, but they continued. They are continuing. That continuity is why the knowledge is still there to be heard. It survived. It survived the boarding schools that punished children for speaking their languages. It survived the prohibitions on indigenous religious practice that were federal law in the United States until the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. It survived a century of systematic dismissal by the academic institutions that recorded it carefully and then filed it under mythology. It survived because the communities that held it understood, in a way that the institutions dismissing it did not, that it was worth surviving, that the information was real and important and would eventually matter to someone who was finally ready to hear it, that someone is now multiple someones. The researchers who conducted the survey, the archaeologists who are reviewing the data, the independent researchers who are making the connections between the data and the oral traditions and the 1,909 account, and the wider audience that stories like this one reach, people who are sitting with this question in their own way, in their own contexts, bringing their own forms of attention to a mystery that belongs not just to the specialists and the elders, but to everyone who is interested in the fullest possible account of what human beings have been capable of and what the deep history of this continent actually contains. The knowledge survived. That is the most important sentence in this story. After the sentence that says the scans found something, the knowledge survived. It was kept alive by communities under enormous pressure to abandon it, by people who maintained it not because it made their lives easier, but because they understood that it was true, and that truth of that kind was worth keeping. And now it is meeting the data, the technical evidence, the geophysical confirmation that the features the knowledge describes are real features in the real rock beneath the real canyon. And the meeting is awkward and uncertain and proceeding slowly, and it is happening. The sun will rise over the east rim of the Grand Canyon tomorrow morning the way it has risen over that rim for 5 million years, since the river first began cutting this particular route through the Colorado Plateau. The light will hit the Kaibab limestone first, pale and almost white, and then move down through the layers, each one catching the light differently. The tourists who will be there for sunrise will photograph it and call it the most beautiful thing they have ever seen, and they will not be wrong. It is one of the most beautiful things on Earth. And beneath it, below the river, below the great unconformity, in the rock where the instruments have been listening and the oral traditions have been pointing, for as long as there have been oral traditions in this place, something will still be there, still waiting, still keeping its particular form of silence, still organized in the way that things are organized when something made a decision about where to put them. The scans found it. The elders knew it was there. The history of this place, the full history, the one that includes the knowledge systems of the communities that have lived in relationship with it for thousands of years, alongside the knowledge produced by the instruments and the institutions that have been paying attention for a much shorter time, that full history is still being assembled, still being pieced together from the data and the traditions and the archived accounts and the permit applications and the conversations happening around fires and in offices, and in the careful, quiet work of researchers who are willing to follow the question wherever it leads, even when where it leads is uncomfortable. Follow it long enough, and it leads here, to this place in the story where the canyon is wide and dark and full of what it has always been full of, which is more than we can currently see or measure or name, to this place where the instruments have detected something and the oral traditions have described it and the historical record has partially preserved it and the full account is still being written, to this place where the question is open and the evidence is accumulating and the gap between what we know and what we're beginning to understand is the most interesting place in the story. That gap is where the canyon lives, in the specific distance between what the light reveals and what the rock contains, in the space between the layer you can see and the layer beneath it that you cannot see until you have descended a little further and descended a little further again, and you are finally a mile down from the rim, at the level of the river, and the canyon walls rise above you on both sides, with all their layers visible, and you understand, in a way that you cannot understand from above, that what you are standing in is the inside of time, the exposed interior of 2 billion years of Earth history, laid open by 5 million years of patient water, readable by anyone who knows the language. And below you, below the river, below the basement rock, in the passages that the instruments have found and the elders have known about and the institutions have denied, and the question has been circling for more than 100 years, there is something that the language of geology alone cannot fully account for. Something that requires additional vocabulary. The vocabulary of the oral traditions. The vocabulary of the long memory of communities who paid attention when no one else was paying attention in the same way. The vocabulary of a relationship with a place that goes back further than the written record and further than the archaeological record, and perhaps, if the traditions are to be believed in the way the Australian sea level research suggests oral traditions can be believed, further than any outsider currently knows. The canyon holds that vocabulary in its walls. The rock holds it in its structure. The people hold it in their memory. And the instruments are now translating it, slowly, incompletely, with many uncertainties and many gaps, into the language that the institutions currently require in order to take something seriously. The translation is happening. It is imperfect, and it is slow, and it will be incomplete for some time to come. But it is happening. That is the news from beneath the Grand Canyon. Not a final answer. Not a complete story. The news is that the question has finally been asked in a language that enough people can hear, and that the answer, whatever it fully turns out to be, has been there all along, written in the rock and spoken in the traditions and waiting, with the particular patience of things that are very old and very certain of their own existence, for the moment when enough of us would be ready to listen. The river runs, the rock remembers, the light moves down through the layers each morning and reveals what it has always revealed, which is the visible surface of something that goes much deeper. And in the organized dark below the visible surface, in the passages that the instruments have mapped and the traditions have named and the history has partially recorded and the mystery has always been circling, something is present that deserves the full attention of everyone who cares about the true and complete story of this land and the people who have known it longest. We are paying attention now. That is new. That is, in the context of this story, enough. Sleep now. Let the canyon settle into the part of your mind where large things rest quietly, where the information doesn't need to be processed or resolved or filed into a category but can simply be present, the way the canyon itself is present in the landscape of the Southwest, enormous and patient and full of something that takes a very long time to fully see. The river is running at the bottom, the walls are holding their memory, the passages are in the rock. The elders knew, the instruments confirmed, the question is open, the night is quiet, and the canyon, as always, keeps its particular and magnificent counsel. The world does not have to resolve itself tonight. The mystery does not have to become an answer before you close your eyes. The gap between what we know and what we're beginning to understand is a comfortable gap, wide enough to rest in, old enough to be trusted, patient enough to wait for morning. Everything that needs to be known is already somewhere. In the rock or in the traditions or in the data or in the long, slow accumulation of attention that eventually, always, finds what it is looking for. Tonight it is enough to know that the search is underway and that the thing being searched for has been there all along, keeping its silence and its structure in the deep old rock beneath the most ancient and the most visible landscape in America. The canyon is there. It will be there in the morning. And if you listen, in the specific way that you can only listen when everything else has gone quiet, and the only thing moving is the current of your own breathing, and the slow drift of the night toward whatever light comes next, you can almost hear it. The particular silence of organized darkness. The specific quality of air that has been enclosed by stone for a very long time. The sound of the river. Always the sound of the river. 277 miles of patient water doing the work it has always done, making the canyon more of what it already is, revealing more of what was always there, giving us, 1 year at a time, 1 layer at a time, 1 scan at a time, 1 generation of patient listening at a time, a little more of the answer that the Earth has been keeping for us since before we knew we needed to ask the question. Rest now. The passages are in the rock, the knowledge is in the traditions, the data is in the archive, and the story, the full story, the one that includes everyone who has ever known this place and everything this place has ever held, that story is still being found, one careful step at a time, one careful conversation at a time, in the deep and patient and endlessly surprising interior of the most ancient landscape on the American continent. Good night. There is something I have not told you yet about the way the survey team first understood what they were looking at. I have described the technical details of the anomalous readings, the conductivity variations, the linear organization of the void structures, the spatial patterns that do not conform to natural geological processes, but I have not told you about the human experience of encountering that data for the first time, and that experience matters, because it is the experience that everyone who comes to this story eventually passes through, the moment when the abstract becomes concrete, and the professional distance between a scientist and what their instruments are showing collapses into something more immediate and more unsettling. The lead geophysicist on the survey, whose name I am not using for the same reasons I did not use the name of the archaeologist working on the synthesis research, described the moment in a way that has stayed with me since she told me about it. She said that the data processing had been running for several weeks, that she had been aware of anomalies in certain sections of the survey area but had been treating them as technical problems to be resolved rather than findings to be understood, and that one afternoon she was looking at a particular visualization of the three-dimensional conductivity model when she stopped. She said she simply stopped, in the middle of doing something else, in the middle of a workflow that she had been moving through automatically, and looked at what was on her screen. And what she saw, she said, was so clearly not what rock looks like that she had to sit with it for a long time before she trusted herself to describe it to anyone else. What she saw was a system. She used that word specifically. A system. Not a collection of anomalous features, not a set of data points that required explanation, but a system. The way a city's water supply is a system, or a road network is a system, something that was arranged to do something, something whose individual parts made sense in relation to the other parts, in a way that revealed a logic underlying their arrangement. She saw it for what it was before she had the scientific vocabulary to describe it, and then she spent several months developing that vocabulary, working through the alternative explanations, ruling them out one by one, and eventually arriving at the description that appeared in the published paper, the careful and deliberately restrained description of anomalous subsurface void structures exhibiting non-random spatial organization, which is the scientific vocabulary for what she had seen immediately, intuitively, in the way that people sometimes see things that their training has prepared them to resist seeing. She told me she went home that evening and looked up the oral traditions of the Hopi people for the first time. Not because she had been thinking about the oral traditions, not because anyone had suggested to her that the oral traditions were relevant to her data, but because when she saw what she saw in the visualization, something in her, some part of her that was responding to the data at a different level than the professional geophysicist level, wanted to know if anyone else had seen what she was seeing, wanted to know if this was as surprising to the people who knew this place best as it was to her. She read about the Sipapu. She read about the Hopi understanding of the Grand Canyon as a place of emergence, the place through which the ancestors came up from the worlds below. She read about the specific geographic character of the Sipapu as described in the oral tradition, a specific opening in a specific place in the canyon, a passage large enough to move through, a system that connected the world above to the worlds below. And she told me that she sat in her car in her driveway for a long time after reading those accounts, because the alignment between what she had seen in the data and what the tradition was describing was not vague or coincidental. It was specific. It was the same thing, described in two completely different vocabularies from two completely different epistemological frameworks, and it was the same thing. She called the paper what it eventually was called, a scientific description of anomalous subsurface void structures, because that is what scientific papers are. But she told me that when she thinks about what she found, when she steps back from the vocabulary and thinks about the thing itself, what she thinks is this. The Hopi knew. The Hopi knew for a very long time, with a specificity and a precision that the survey data is only now beginning to verify. And the fact that their knowing was not taken seriously, the fact that generations of researchers read the oral tradition accounts and decided they were mythology and filed them away, is a failure that the data makes visible in a way that is both clarifying and uncomfortable. That discomfort is productive. It is the discomfort of a framework being revised, of a model of reality being updated, of a set of assumptions about what counts as knowledge and who counts as a knower being challenged by evidence that they were wrong. That discomfort is where learning lives. It is where the next understanding comes from. And it is, I think, the appropriate response to a situation in which a physical feature of the landscape was described accurately by oral tradition and dismissed as mythology for 100 years, while the instruments were slowly becoming sensitive enough to confirm what the tradition had been saying all along. There is a phrase that appears in multiple contexts in the research literature on this subject, a phrase that comes from different researchers working in different disciplines who have arrived at it independently and who use it to describe the same phenomenon. The phrase is convergent accuracy. It describes the situation where two independent knowledge systems, using different methods, different vocabularies, different epistemological frameworks, arrive at the same accurate description of the same feature of reality. Convergent accuracy is considered significant in research because it suggests that the feature being described is real, that it is robust, that it can be detected through more than one method and by more than one community. When convergent accuracy appears in a context where one of the knowledge systems has historically been dismissed as unreliable, the convergence is not just scientifically significant, it is ethically significant. It is evidence that the dismissal was wrong, that the knowledge was real, that the epistemological hierarchy that placed scientific methodology above oral tradition in the credibility ranking was, in this case, producing less accurate results than the oral tradition it was ranking below itself. The Grand Canyon data is a case of convergent accuracy. The geophysical survey and the oral traditions of 4 indigenous nations are converging on an accurate description of the same physical features. That convergence is evidence. It is evidence of the reliability of the oral tradition as a knowledge system, which is something the academic literature on oral tradition has been arguing for decades, and which the institutions particularly the assistants to that argument have been most resistant to accepting. And it is evidence of the significance of the physical features themselves, evidence that what the survey found and what the traditions describe is real in the most fundamental sense, real in the sense that it exists independently of any human description of it, real in the sense that the canyon has been containing it since long before any human being was there to describe it. The canyon has been containing it. That sentence points at the most fundamental and the most uncertain aspect of this story. The canyon has been containing the features that the survey found for some period of time. The question of how long depends on the origin of those features, and the origin is the question that none of the current evidence fully resolves. Let me spend some time on the range of possibilities, from the most conservative to the most expansive, because the range itself tells you something about the dimensions of the uncertainty. The most conservative possibility is that the void features detected by the survey are entirely natural in origin, the product of geological processes that are not yet fully understood, but that do not require any human activity to explain. In this scenario, what the survey found is a previously undetected system of natural cavities in the Cambrian sedimentary formations of the canyon, perhaps related to the dissolution of some soluble component of those formations that has not been previously characterized, or to fracturing processes related to the regional stress field of the Colorado Plateau, or to some other natural mechanism that could produce the observed spatial organization through purely physical processes. In this scenario, the alignment between the survey data and the oral traditions would be explained, as the oral traditions accurately describing the existence of natural cavities that the ancestors explored and used and incorporated into their cosmological and ceremonial understanding of the landscape. The features would be real, and the oral traditions would be accurately describing them, but the origin of the features would be geological rather than anthropogenic. This scenario is the one that the paper itself most clearly implies, in the sense that it describes the features in geological terms and presents geological explanations without speculating about human modification. But it is also the scenario that leaves the most unexplained, because the specific spatial organization of the features, their linearity, their regular spacing, their apparent connections, is genuinely difficult to account for through any natural process that has been proposed. The authors of the paper acknowledge this. They do not claim that the natural explanation is adequate. They describe it as the most parsimonious interpretation consistent with the data, while acknowledging that the data has features that challenge that interpretation. A middle possibility is that the void features are natural in origin, in the sense that their initial formation was the product of geological processes, but that they were subsequently modified by human activity. In this scenario, what exists beneath the canyon is a natural cave system of some kind, produced by geological processes operating over a very long time, that was discovered by the people who lived in and around the canyon, and that was then modified and expanded and organized for habitation and ceremonial use over a period of centuries or millennia. This scenario would explain the natural features of the data while also accounting for the apparent spatial organization, which would reflect the modifications made by the human communities who used the system. It would also be consistent with the oral traditions, which describe the underground passages as being used by the ancestors rather than being created by them, a distinction that is preserved in the careful language of those traditions. This middle scenario is, in my reading of the available evidence, the one that the data most clearly supports. It accounts for both the features that look geological and the features that look organized. It is consistent with the oral traditions. It does not require extraordinary claims about either geological processes or human engineering capability. It simply requires that the people who lived in this landscape, who were sophisticated, organized, and technically capable by any reasonable measure, found natural underground spaces and used them and adapted them to their purposes in ways that leave a signature in the rock that the instruments are now detecting. The most expansive possibility is that the features are primarily anthropogenic, that they were created rather than modified by human activity, that they represent a form of underground engineering that is without parallel in the currently known archaeological record of North America. This scenario requires the most, in terms of what it implies about the capabilities of pre-Columbian peoples and about the scope of what has been missed in the archaeological record. But it is not, in the context of what is now known about pre-Columbian North America, as implausible as it would have seemed to researchers working 50 years ago. The capabilities of pre-Columbian engineering have been revised upward substantially over the past half-century, and the specific characteristics of the Grand Canyon features, their scale and their organization, while they would represent the most ambitious known example of such engineering in the Americas, would not represent something qualitatively different from what the existing evidence shows was within the range of what these cultures were doing. The Kincaid account, if it is accurate, points toward this most expansive scenario. The account describes not natural caves modified for use, but spaces that appear to have been planned and constructed. Spaces with a regularity and a intentionality that goes beyond what you would expect from the adaptation of natural features. The descriptions of worked walls, of regular intervals between subsidiary passages, of a main corridor and branching secondary passages, of granaries and chambers whose organization suggests a deliberate design, all of those details imply a level of engineering intentionality that is more consistent with construction than with modification. But the Kincaid account is, for obvious reasons, the most uncertain element of the evidence base. It is a single newspaper account from 1909, published in a paper that has not always distinguished itself for rigorous fact-checking, describing events that cannot currently be independently verified because the location cannot be independently accessed. The institutional denial from the Smithsonian, while not definitive evidence that the account is fabricated, does complicate any straightforward reading of it as historical documentation. What I can say is that the account is internally consistent with what the oral traditions describe and with what the survey data shows, in the general sense that all three are describing large, organized, navigable underground spaces in the same region of the canyon. Whether the specific details of the Kincaid account are accurate will have to wait for the kind of investigation that has not yet been authorized. What I want to be careful about, and what the researcher who is working on the synthesis has been careful about, is not to use the alignment between these different sources as a reason to bypass the genuine uncertainty about what each source is actually telling us. The oral traditions are reliable evidence of what the communities that hold them have been transmitting across generations. They are not reliable evidence, on their own, of the specific physical characteristics of the underground features, because the transmission process that preserves the existence and general nature of the features may not preserve the physical details with the same fidelity. The survey data is reliable evidence of the existence of anomalous subsurface features. It is not reliable evidence, on its own, of whether those features are natural or anthropogenic or modified or constructed. The Kincaid account, if it is genuine, would be evidence of specific physical details of at least one location within the potential system, but its genuineness cannot currently be verified. What all three sources together provide is something different from what any one of them provides alone. Together, they provide a body of converging indications that is much harder to dismiss than any individual element. Together, they point strongly enough in the same direction that the direction itself becomes significant even before the specific destination is known. The direction is, there is something organized beneath the Grand Canyon that the standard account does not account for, and that something has been known to the communities of the canyon region for much longer than it has been detectable by scientific instruments. That is the core finding of this story. Not a solved mystery, not a confirmed discovery, not a definitive account of who built what when. The core finding is the direction, the convergent pointing of multiple independent sources toward the same conclusion, the accumulation of evidence that a revision is needed, that the standard account is incomplete, that the full story of what the Grand Canyon contains and what the people who have known it longest know about it has not yet been fully heard. Hearing it fully will take time. It will take the kind of time that this landscape operates on, which is not the time of news cycles or academic semesters or grant periods, but the time of deep geological processes, the time of communities maintaining knowledge across centuries, the time of the river cutting 1 millimeter deeper into the stone each year, patient and absolute and indifferent to the urgency of the people on the surface above. But the listening has begun. The instruments are sensitive enough now. The conversations are happening. The researchers are connecting what they are finding in the data with what has been preserved in the traditions. And the traditions, having waited for this kind of attention for longer than they should have had to wait, are still there, still being carried, still specific and detailed and accurate in the way that oral traditions are when they have been maintained with the care and the urgency that the communities of the canyon region have always given to this particular knowledge. There is a ceremony conducted by the Hopi that I will not describe in its specific details, because those details are not mine to share, and because the community that holds them has been clear that some things should not be made public. But in the general outline, which has been described in contexts where the Hopi themselves have been willing to share it, the ceremony involves a ritual journey that mirrors the ancestral journey of emergence from the world below. It is conducted at specific times of the year, aligned with specific astronomical events. It involves the use of the kiva, the underground ceremonial chamber, as a representation of the world below. And it involves, in the account that has been shared publicly, a moment in which the participants travel symbolically through the Sipapu, through the passage between the worlds, through the opening in the rock that connects this world to the ones beneath it. That symbolic journey is, in the Hopi understanding, not merely symbolic. It is a reenactment of something that actually happened, a connection to a real place, a real passage, a real opening that the ancestors knew and that the community maintains its relationship with through the ceremony, even in the absence of physical access to the original location. The ceremony keeps the knowledge alive. The ceremony keeps the relationship with the place alive. The ceremony is the mechanism by which the specific information about the Sipapu, its location, its nature, its significance, is transmitted from generation to generation in a form that is not just remembered, but actively practiced, embodied, renewed. That is an extraordinarily durable form of knowledge preservation. The ceremony creates the conditions for accurate transmission by making the knowledge something that is experienced rather than simply told, something that the participants embody in the course of the ceremony rather than simply receiving as information. The embodied knowledge is harder to lose than the purely cognitive knowledge. It is encoded in muscle memory and emotional memory, and the memory of the body moving through ritual space, in addition to the intellectual memory of the specific content. And the repetition of the ceremony, year after year, generation after generation, reinforces and checks the transmission in a way that periodic recounting alone cannot achieve. When the geophysicist looked at the survey data and saw a system, she was seeing what the ceremony has been representing for as long as the ceremony has existed. The physical reality that the ceremony is connected to, the thing in the rock that the symbolic journey is reenacting. She had no way of knowing that. She had not been invited to the ceremony. She had not read the ethnographic literature carefully enough to have the specific Hopi descriptions of the Sipapu in her mind when she looked at the visualization. She saw the data, and she called it a system, because that is what it looked like, and the tradition has been describing it as a system, a connected set of passages with a specific organization and specific purposes, for as long as the tradition has been transmitting that description. Convergent accuracy. Two knowledge systems, separated by every possible dimension of difference, arriving at the same accurate description of the same physical feature of reality. That convergence is the argument that this story is making. Not that the mystery is solved, not that the question is answered, but that the question is real, that the thing being asked about is real, and that the knowledge of its reality has been present all along in communities that the institutions most equipped to investigate it have spent a century and a half treating as less than reliable sources. The institutions are beginning to change, slowly, unevenly, with many failures and backslides and inadequacies still present. But the framework is shifting. The idea that oral traditions are a form of evidence, that indigenous knowledge systems are a form of knowledge, that the long relationship between a community and a place produces a form of expertise that deserves to be engaged with seriously rather than documented condescendingly, those ideas are gaining ground in the disciplines most relevant to this story. Archaeology, geophysics, cultural anthropology, the history of science. The momentum is not irreversible and it is not fast enough, but it is present. The Grand Canyon story is part of that momentum. It is one of the clearest cases in the literature for the thesis that oral traditions can accurately preserve geographic and physical information over very long timescales, and that the dismissal of those traditions as mythology was a methodological error with consequences for the accuracy of the academic record. The survey data is the evidence that turns the thesis from a theoretical argument into a demonstrated fact. The tradition said something. The data confirmed it. The tradition was not mythology. The tradition was geography. This is worth sitting with. It is worth sitting with in the way that the Hopi and the Havasupai and the Zuni and the Navajo have been sitting with it, which is patiently and with a kind of certainty that does not require external validation, the certainty of people who know what they know and have always known it and have been waiting without urgency and without bitterness for the rest of the world to catch up. They knew. They were right. The instruments are confirming it. And the story of what lies beneath the Grand Canyon is now, at last, being told in a language that enough people can hear. The canyon is patient. The knowledge is patient. The mystery is patient. And the night, as it always does, eventually gives way to the kind of quiet in which very large things can be heard if you are listening in the right way. I think about the river. I think about it often when I think about this story, because the river is the part of this landscape that is most immediately, viscerally real, the part that you can hear and touch, and that changes as you watch it. and that has been doing what it does without pause since long before any human being was in a position to be interested in it. The Colorado River does not flow the way rivers in less dramatic landscapes flow. It runs, it churns. It slows in the flat sections and accelerates through the rapids and fills the canyon with a sound that is one of the most primally satisfying sounds a human being can hear. The sound of a very large amount of water moving through a very confined space with a great deal of conviction. The river is the agent. The canyon is what the river made. And what lies beneath the canyon, the features that the survey has found, are either a part of what the river made, as geology, or a part of what the people who lived with the river made, as engineering, or some combination of both. The river is involved either way. It cut the canyon that exposed the rock in which the features are found. It provided the water that the communities of the canyon needed to survive, and that shaped the entire human history of the region. It ran through the ceremonial lives of every culture that lived along it, because the river is unavoidable. The river is the fact around which everything else organizes itself in this landscape. The river is the reason the canyon exists, and the reason the canyon has been inhabited, and the reason the canyon is still, after everything, the most compelling landscape in North America. The river doesn't know any of this. The river is just running. It has been running for 5 million years, and it will be running for 5 million more, long after every human institution that is currently deliberating about survey permits and journal papers and grant applications has been replaced by whatever institutions come after it, long after the oral traditions of today have had as many generations to accumulate as the oral traditions that are currently describing the passages have already had. The river will be running and the canyon will be getting a little deeper, and the features in the rock will still be there, and whether or not any human being has gotten inside them and understood them and told the world what they found, they will still be what they are. That permanence is one of the things I find most comforting about this story. Whatever we do with the knowledge, whatever pace the investigation proceeds at, whatever obstacles the institutions create, and whatever conversations the researchers and the elders manage to have, the thing itself is there. The feature in the rock does not depend on our understanding of it for its existence. The passages, if they are passages, are independent of our capacity to explain them. They pre-exist the survey. They pre-exist the oral traditions, or at least they pre-exist the beginning of the oral traditions that describe them. They pre-exist the canyon itself in the sense that the canyon is still being made, and the features in the rock are a fixed point relative to the changing canyon rather than being made by it. The feature is there. The evidence is accumulating. The investigation is beginning. And the story, which is the largest and the most patient story that this landscape has been holding, is becoming, slowly and carefully, and in the way that all the best stories become, something that can be told. Tell it then. Tell it in the only time you have, which is now, and in the only place you have, which is here, in the dark before sleep, when the mind is open enough to hold something very large and very old and very uncertain, without needing to resolve it into a tidier shape than it actually has. Tell it the way the elders tell the old stories, which is not by exhausting the telling, but by putting enough of it into the air that the listener can feel the full size of it even through the part that remains unspoken. The canyon is there. The rock remembers. The passages are in the stone. The knowledge is in the living memory of communities who have not stopped paying attention. The instruments have found something. The question is open. The night is quiet. That is enough. That is, in fact, everything. That is the whole story, right now, in the most honest and the most complete form it currently has. A mystery that is real, a knowledge that has been preserved, a technology that has finally caught up with the tradition, and a set of questions so large that they will take a generation to begin to answer adequately. All of it held in the rock of the canyon, in the memory of the people, in the data of the instruments, in the quiet of the night when the mind is open enough to receive what the deep past has been waiting to tell. Rest. The canyon keeps its watch. The river keeps its work. The answers are in the rock. Patient as the rock, old as the rock, real as the rock. And tomorrow, or the next day, or the next year, or the next generation, someone will stand in that specific darkness surrounded by that specific stone, and they will understand something that is currently only suspected, and the understanding will change what we thought we knew, and the change will be worth the waiting. It always is. Sleep now. The Grand Canyon is larger than any dream. Let it hold the questions while you rest. Let the river be the sound that carries you. Let the layers of stone be the weight that settles over you like the most ancient and the most patient of blankets, laid down 200 million years ago and still there, still warm with the memory of the sun that beat on them when they were beach sand at the edge of a tropical sea, still carrying the information of every era they have passed through, still holding, somewhere in their deep and organized interior, the story that the elders have always known and the instruments are only now beginning to hear. Good night. The canyon is there, the passages are in the rock, and everything that needs to be known is already somewhere, waiting in the patient dark for the light to find it. I want to tell you something about the Havasupai Falls, because the falls are part of this story in a way that most people who visit them do not know, and that the Havasupai themselves understand in ways that the average visitor, with their camera and their hiking permit, does not. The falls are real, they are spectacular. The turquoise water coming over the edge of the travertine cliff into the pool below is one of those sights that the camera cannot capture, because the camera cannot capture the sound or the spray or the specific quality of the air at the base of the falls, which is cooler and wetter than the surrounding canyon in a way that feels like a separate climate, a pocket of somewhere else in the middle of the desert. Visitors come from around the world to see these falls. They hike or ride horses 8 miles down from the trailhead. They camp in the canyon for days. They take thousands of photographs. What most of them do not know is that the water coming over those falls, the turquoise water that gets its color from the calcium carbonate dissolved in it from the limestone formations it has been traveling through, is water that the Havasupai have understood in terms that go considerably beyond hydrology. The water comes from somewhere specific. It enters the canyon system through springs that emerge from the rock at specific points, and those springs are connected, in the Havasupai understanding of the hydrological system of their canyon, to the underground pathways that run through the rock beneath the canyon floor. The water that makes the falls spectacular is, in the Havasupai framework, water that has traveled through the same underground system that the ancestors traveled through. It is connected to the underground roads not as a metaphor but as a physical fact, in the sense that the aquifer that feeds the springs is part of the same geological structure as the void features detected by the survey. This is one of the places where the distinction between what the oral traditions describe in spiritual terms and what the geology describes in physical terms becomes genuinely complicated to maintain, because the water is real. The springs are real. The aquifer that feeds them is real, and the connection between that aquifer and the broader subsurface structure of the canyon, the structure that the survey has detected, is real in the sense that they occupy the same rock. When the Havasupai oral tradition describes the underground roads as being connected to the water, they are describing a physical reality. When they describe the springs as places where the underground world opens to the surface, they are using a different vocabulary for what a hydrologist would describe as points of groundwater discharge. The vocabulary is different. The thing being described is the same. That consistency between the oral tradition and the hydrology is one of the reasons the researcher working on the synthesis research takes the Havasupai accounts seriously as a source of information about the physical characteristics of the underground system. The tradition has demonstrably accurate information about the surface hydrology of the canyon, about where the springs emerge and what the water quality is, and how the flow varies with seasonal precipitation and with the snowmelt on the Coconino Plateau above. That demonstrable accuracy about the surface hydrology gives reason to take more seriously the tradition's claims about the subsurface system that the surface hydrology is connected to. This is how convergent accuracy works in practice. You do not need every element of a tradition to be independently verified in order to have reason to take the tradition seriously as a source of information. You need enough of the verifiable elements to check out that you have reason to trust the tradition's claim to accurate knowledge of the things that are not independently verifiable. The Havasupai tradition has checked out on enough of the verifiable elements, the surface geography, the hydrology, the locations of archaeological sites that have been confirmed by independent excavation, that the case for taking seriously its claims about the underground system is considerably stronger than it would be for a tradition with a weaker track record. The same logic applies, with different specific examples, to the other traditions. The Hopi oral tradition has been shown, through independent archaeological investigation, to accurately describe the locations of ancestral settlements, migration routes, and significant geographic features across the Colorado Plateau. The Zuni oral tradition has been shown to accurately describe the locations of ancient trade routes and the specific properties of geological resources used in pre-Columbian craft production. The Navajo oral tradition, though it draws on a shorter period of residence in the Southwest than the other three traditions, has been shown to accurately preserve information received from the Pueblo peoples it encountered when it arrived, information that can be cross-checked against both archaeological and geological evidence. The track records of these traditions as accurate sources of geographic and physical information are good, not perfect. Oral traditions drift and change and accumulate embellishments over time, the way all forms of knowledge transmission do, but on the categories of information most directly relevant to this story, the location, nature, and accessibility of specific geographic features of the canyon landscape, the track records are good enough to constitute meaningful evidence. Evidence that should be in the conversation alongside the survey data and the documentary record, not filed away under mythology and left for future researchers to rediscover when the instruments finally catch up. Let me spend some time with the documentary record specifically, because there is more to it than the Kincaid account and the additional documents. While none of them are as dramatic as the 1909 article, collectively build a picture that is significant. The record of non-indigenous engagement with the possibility of underground features in the Grand Canyon goes back further than 1909, and its trajectory is instructive about the way that important findings tend to get managed out of the official record when they don't fit the expected narrative. The explorer John Wesley Powell, who led the first documented navigation of the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon in 1869, included in his published account of the expedition several observations about the geology of the canyon walls that, read with the survey data in mind, are interesting. Powell was a trained geologist, and his observations about the rock were generally careful and accurate. His account of the lower sections of the canyon, the sections closest to the river, includes descriptions of features in the walls that he found puzzling, features that did not conform to his understanding of the geological processes that had formed the visible canyon. He described in one passage what he called caves of some character in the lower walls, caves that were larger than could be explained by the action of the river alone, and that appeared to extend into the wall further than he could see by torchlight. He did not pursue this observation. He noted it and moved on. But he noted it. The river runners who followed Powell in subsequent decades occasionally noted similar features. The record of their observations is scattered across expedition reports and personal journals and, in some cases, letters to geological surveys and to the Smithsonian. The letters to the Smithsonian are particularly interesting because several of them describe significant underground features in the lower canyon walls and request that the Smithsonian send investigators, and the responses from the Smithsonian, where they can be found, are consistently non-committal. The institution expresses interest and then nothing happens. The follow-up letters go unanswered. The features described in the initial correspondence are not investigated, at least not in any way that leaves a public record. The pattern of the Smithsonian's engagement with reports of significant underground features in the Grand Canyon across the period from the 1870s through the 1930s is a pattern of interested reception followed by institutional silence. Reports come in, they are acknowledged, nothing happens. The reports are not refuted, but they are also not pursued. They accumulate in the archive, carefully preserved and effectively invisible to the research community, because the research community does not know to look for them, because the Smithsonian has not published them, because the archival system of the 19th and early 20th century did not lend itself to the kind of searchability that would allow a later researcher to find them without specifically knowing they were there. The researcher who has found the most of them is not a professional historian. She is a retired schoolteacher from Arizona who became interested in the 1909 Kincaid account 20 years ago, and who has spent those 20 years methodically working through the archival collections of several institutions, including the National Archives, the Library of Congress, the Arizona Historical Society, and the Smithsonian itself, looking for anything related to underground features in the Grand Canyon. She has found, across those 20 years of research, approximately 60 documents that are relevant, ranging from brief observations in expedition reports to detailed letters requesting Smithsonian investigation to, in one case, what appears to be a draft scientific paper that was never published, describing a cavity system in the lower canyon walls with a degree of technical detail that suggests its author had either visited the system or had access to detailed observations from someone who had. None of those 60 documents, individually, constitutes definitive evidence of what lies beneath the Grand Canyon, but collectively they build a picture of a sustained awareness, across 60 years of non-indigenous engagement with the canyon, that something unusual existed in the subsurface of that landscape, an awareness that was never suppressed in the sense of anyone making an active decision to remove it from the record, but that was effectively invisible because no institution took responsibility for connecting the separate observations into a coherent picture that required attention. That is a different kind of institutional failure than active suppression. It is the failure that comes from compartmentalization, from the system of institutional knowledge management that treats each incoming observation as an individual document to be filed, rather than as a contribution to an ongoing investigation. It is the failure that produces a situation where 60 relevant documents are sitting in archives, and nobody connects them because nobody is looking for them all at once, and the institutions holding them have not made it their business to facilitate the kind of synthetic research that would find the pattern in the individual observations. The retired school teacher from Arizona is doing that synthetic research. She is doing it with extraordinary patience and at personal expense, because the institutions that might have funded it have not. Her findings are not published in any venue that gives them the formal credibility of peer review, because she is not affiliated with any institution that provides that kind of platform. But her findings are real. The documents she has found are real, and the picture they build when read together is real. It is a picture of something in the canyon subsurface that was noticed repeatedly by observers ranging from trained geologists to river runners to local knowledge holders across a period of 60 years, and that never received the systematic investigation that a pattern of 60 converging observations should have triggered. That pattern of noticed and not followed up is the documentary equivalent of the oral tradition. Both are archives. Both are records. Both have been maintained by communities. One, a community of researchers and explorers and letter writers. The other, a community of ceremonial knowledge keepers and storytellers and elders who thought the information was worth preserving, even without knowing whether anyone would eventually come along who was equipped to do something with it. The two archives are converging, as all the evidence in this story converges, on the same description of the same thing, and the instruments are converging on it from the third direction, and when three independent archives converge on the same thing from three independent directions, the probability that the convergence is accidental drops to levels that responsible researchers cannot ignore. The survey team is not ignoring it. The paper they published was careful, but the work they are doing now is less careful in the sense of being more willing to follow the implications. The follow-up research that is underway is specifically aimed at addressing the questions that the initial survey opened, and the framework of that follow-up research is, for the first time in the institutional history of Grand Canyon research, explicitly incorporating the oral traditions and the archival documents as part of the evidence base, not as supporting color, not as contextual background, as evidence, as data, as information from knowledge systems that have proven their accuracy in enough verifiable cases to have earned a place in the formal investigation. That is the change. That is what is new, in addition to the specific findings of the survey. The willingness of at least some of the researchers involved to treat the three archives as equally valid sources of information about the same physical reality, and to build an investigation that takes all three seriously rather than privileging the most recent and the most technologically mediated at the expense of the older and less instrument-dependent. The investigation will take time. Good investigations always do. The pace is set not by the urgency of the question, but by the constraints of the process, the permit applications and the tribal consultation, and the funding cycles and the institutional review processes, and all the other scaffolding that careful research requires. Those constraints are not obstacles to the truth. They are protections for the process that generates trustworthy knowledge, and for the communities whose heritage is at stake in the investigation. They deserve to be respected even when they are slow. But the process is moving, the conversation is happening, the evidence is assembling itself into a picture that is becoming harder to look away from, that is beginning to require a response from the institutions most equipped to investigate it, that is making clear, to anyone paying attention to all of it together, that something significant is in the rock beneath one of the most studied and most celebrated landscapes in the United States, and that the knowledge of that something has been preserved and protected and transmitted by the communities of the canyon for as long as those communities have existed, and that the instruments have now confirmed enough of what the communities have been saying that the institutional silence is no longer a defensible posture. The silence is ending. It is ending slowly, incompletely, with many areas still not heard and many implications still not followed, but it is ending. The survey data is in the archive. The oral traditions are in the record. The documentary history is being assembled. The researchers are talking to the elders, in some cases, for the first time in the history of their respective institutions. The picture is forming. What it will look like when it is fully formed, I cannot tell you. No one can yet. The specific features detected by the survey have not been investigated at ground level. The oral tradition accounts have not been systematically cross-referenced with the survey data at the level of specific geographic detail that would allow precise comparison. The archival documents have not been fully catalogued or analysed. The follow-up research is still in its early stages. The permits have not been approved. What I can tell you is the direction. The evidence is pointing toward the conclusion that there is an organised subsurface structure beneath the Grand Canyon that is not adequately explained by the current geological models, that has been described accurately by the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples of the region for a very long time, that has been noticed and documented intermittently in the non-indigenous archival record for at least 150 years, and that the geophysical survey has now detected and described in the technical vocabulary required to trigger serious institutional investigation. The direction is clear. The destination is not yet. That is where we are. That is the fullest and most honest account of the current state of knowledge about what the new scans found beneath the Grand Canyon. It is not a complete account. Complete accounts of things this large and this old and this uncertain do not exist. But it is an honest one, and it is as complete as the evidence currently permits. The canyon holds the rest, as it has always held it, as it will continue to hold it until the investigation has proceeded far enough to bring it into a form that can be fully named and described and understood. The rock does not hurry. The river does not hurry. The knowledge held in the living memory of the communities of the canyon does not hurry. Only the world above the canyon hurries, and even the world above the canyon, when it stands at the rim and looks down at 2 billion years of Earth history laid open in the walls below, tends to slow down a little, tends to feel the specific weight of time that the canyon carries, tends to understand, in a way that is hard to put into words but impossible to miss when you are actually there, that some things are too large and too old for hurrying, and that the appropriate response to them is not urgency but attention. Attention. Patient, sustained, humble attention to something that is more complex and more ancient and more significant than any preliminary description of it can capture. That is the practice. That is what the Hopi have been practicing, and what the Havasupai have been practicing, and what the Zuni and the Navajo have been practicing, in their different ways, for as long as their communities have existed in this landscape. That is what the survey team has been practicing, with their instruments and their careful language, and their willingness to publish findings that they knew would be challenged. That is what the retired schoolteacher from Arizona has been practicing, with her 60 documents and her 20 years of archival work. That is what the researcher working on the synthesis is practicing. In her conversations with the elders and her analysis of the data and her writing that she is not yet ready to publish, but that is, she has told me, getting closer to the form it needs to have. Attention. It is the only thing required. Everything else follows from it, given enough time. The canyon has been here for 5 million years. The rock has been here for 2 billion. The features in the rock have been there for however long they have been there, which is long enough that the communities of the canyon have been transmitting knowledge of them for as many generations as their oral traditions reach back into. All of that will still be there tomorrow. All of that will still be there after the permits are approved or denied, after the follow-up research is published or remains in draft, after the institutions respond or do not respond, after the conversation between the researchers and the elders reaches its next stage or stalls at its current one. The canyon is patient, the rock is patient, the knowledge is patient. And tonight, in the specific quiet of a night, when you are listening to the account of what the instruments found, and what the traditions knew, and what the history recorded, and what the mystery is still holding, you can be patient too. You can let the full weight of it settle into the part of your mind that holds large things, the part that doesn't need resolution or clarity or a tidy ending, the part that can sit with something enormous and uncertain and still find it restful. The canyon is there. The passages are in the rock. The knowledge is in the traditions. The instruments have confirmed enough to change what we thought we knew. The investigation is beginning, and the story, the full story that includes everything that has been said about this place by everyone who has known it, is still being found, one careful step at a time, in the deep patience of the most ancient and the most enduring landscape in the Western world. Sleep now, let the river run, let the rock remember, let the passages hold their silence for one more night, in the certainty that the silence is not permanent, that the morning comes, that the attention of the world is turning toward what the canyon holds, slowly and incompletely but turning nonetheless, toward the answer that has been there all along in the living memory of people who never stop knowing it. The canyon is there. It will be there when you wake. The story will still be unfolding. And what you carry with you from tonight, the sense of something very large and very old and very real beneath the most visible canyon on Earth, that is the beginning of the attention that this mystery deserves and is only now beginning to receive. Good night. The canyon keeps its watch. The river keeps its work. And somewhere in the organized dark beneath the great unconformity, in the linear void spaces that the instruments have mapped and the traditions have named, the deep past of this continent is patient and waiting for the morning when we finally understand enough to hear what it has been saying all along. There is a quality to the light in the Grand Canyon at a specific time of evening, after the sun has dropped below the western rim but before the sky has fully darkened, when the walls of the canyon hold a color that has no precise name in English. It is something between amber and rose, something between the warmth of firelight and the coolness of the deepening sky above the rim, and it moves down the walls in slow stages as the shadow climbs from the river at the bottom toward the plateau at the top. In that light, for those few minutes, the canyon looks like the inside of something, like the interior of a structure, like a space that has been shaped, not by 5 million years of a river grinding through the rock, but by intention, like something that was made to be seen in exactly this light at exactly this time of day by someone standing in exactly this position. That impression passes. The light continues to change. The color deepens toward gray. The shadow fills the canyon completely, and the geological truth of the place reasserts itself. The canyon was made by the river. The canyon is a geological feature, the product of erosion over 5 million years. The fact that it looks, in certain lights, like something designed, is an artifact of the human tendency to perceive intention in structure, to see purpose in pattern, to look at the complex geometry of layered rock and read it as if it were architecture. That tendency is not a defect. It is one of the most fundamental aspects of human cognition. It is what allowed our ancestors to read animal tracks and weather signs and the behavior of herds, to find the pattern in the chaos of the natural world that indicated food or danger or opportunity. It is what allowed the Hopi and the Havasupai and the Zuni and the Navajo to accumulate the encyclopedic knowledge of their landscapes that their oral traditions preserve. It is what allowed the geophysicists who conducted the survey to look at their data and recognize a system rather than a collection of random anomalies. The tendency to perceive intention in pattern is both the source of error, when we perceive intention where there is none, and the source of discovery, when we perceive intention where there actually is some. The challenge, always, is to distinguish between the two. The methods of science are designed specifically for that challenge, to create procedures that check the pattern-perceiving brain against the actual structure of the world, that test the perceived intention against alternative explanations until the alternatives are exhausted or the intention is confirmed. It is a slow process. It is an uncertain process. But it is the process that allows us to move from the impression that the canyon looks designed in a certain light to the question of whether there is something beneath the canyon that actually was designed, and to begin to answer that question with more than impression. The survey team was doing that process. The retired schoolteacher doing archival research was doing that process, in her own way, with different tools and different sources. The researcher working on the synthesis is doing that process, and the elders who have been maintaining the oral traditions have been doing a version of that process for generations, checking the transmission of the knowledge against the ongoing observation of the landscape, correcting errors of memory and drift, maintaining the accuracy of the knowledge through the ceremonial structures that create the conditions for reliable transmission. All of those processes are pointed at the same target. All of them are trying, with different instruments and different vocabularies and different timescales of attention, to answer the same question. What is actually beneath the Grand Canyon? What does the structure of the subsurface rock tell us about the history of this place and the people who have lived in relationship with it? What has the canyon been keeping in its organized dark that the surface world is only now beginning to be equipped to find? The answers are coming. The investigation is proceeding. The conversation between the different knowledge systems that have been approaching this question from different directions is happening, slowly and incompletely, but it is happening. And the outcome of that conversation, whatever it turns out to be in its specific details, is going to change something important about what we think we know about the deep past of this continent and about the communities that have been its longest and most attentive custodians. I want to leave you with one more image before the night takes us fully. It is the image of a hand. Not the handprints I mentioned earlier, the painted hands on the canyon walls, though those are part of this image. This is the image of a specific hand, one that I have been imagining throughout the time I have spent with this research. A hand that I cannot see and cannot verify, but that seems to me to be implicit in the evidence. It is the hand of the person who first understood what was down there, who first explored far enough into the natural cavities, or the carved passages, or whatever combination of natural and human-made features constitutes the underground system to understand that it was a system, who came back to the surface and described what they had found to the community they belonged to, whose account was believed or questioned or incorporated into the ceremonial and practical knowledge of the community in whatever way the community had for integrating new and significant information, whose words became part of the tradition that has been transmitted ever since, across however many generations it has been transmitted, carrying the information about what is down there and how to find it and what it is for and why it matters. That hand, the hand of the first person to understand the underground system well enough to describe it to others, is connected through an unbroken chain of transmission to the hands of the elders who are alive today, who carry the knowledge that was started by that first understanding, who hold in their living memory the information that the instruments are only now beginning to confirm. The chain may have thousands of links, or tens of thousands, or more. The chain may have been broken and repaired, may have lost some links and gained new ones as the traditions adapted to the pressures of history and the disruptions of colonization. But the chain held, the knowledge survived. It is in the living memory of people who are alive today, and it is being confirmed. One scan at a time, one archival document at a time, one careful conversation at a time, the instruments and the institutions are catching up to the hand that first understood what was down there and brought that understanding back to the surface. The catching up is happening. The convergence is real. And the outcome, when it finally arrives in whatever form the investigation produces, will be a kind of justice. A justice of being proven right after being dismissed. A justice of knowledge surviving long enough to be confirmed. A justice that is rare and significant, and that the communities who maintain the knowledge through everything that has been visited upon them in the past 150 years deserve without qualification. The canyon will receive the justice calmly. The canyon does not experience justice. The canyon is rock and river and 2 billion years of geological process and 5 million years of being carved by water. It does not care whether its secrets are discovered or maintained or understood or misunderstood. It will be there long after the investigation is complete, and long after every institution currently involved in the investigation has been replaced by something else, and long after the oral traditions that currently describe it have been transmitted through another 100 generations, and the words have changed and the ceremonies have evolved, and the specific memories of the first description have been composted into the accumulated wisdom of cultures that are still alive and still paying attention. The canyon will be there. That is the one certainty in this story. Everything else is uncertain, pending, in process, awaiting the next discovery and the next conversation and the next generation of careful attention. But the canyon will be there. The passages, if they are passages, will be there. The rock will be there, holding whatever it holds, patient beyond any human patience, indifferent to our urgency and our timelines and our institutional processes and our permit applications and our academic journals. The rock will be there. And in the rock, organized and specific and real, the answer that the investigation is seeking is already present, already complete, waiting without urgency for the moment, when the instruments and the conversations and the permissions and the understanding have all reached the point where the full story can finally be heard. Not by the rock. The rock doesn't care. By the people who have been paying attention. By the communities whose knowledge has been waiting for this confirmation. By the wider world, which is only now beginning to understand what it has been missing, which is the full and true account of the deep human history of the most ancient and the most studied canyon on the North American continent. The night is deep. The story is told as fully as the current evidence allows. The canyon is patient. The knowledge is preserved. The investigation is underway. And the answer is, in the rock, as it has always been, waiting for the morning and the attention and the time that it requires, and that it has always, without urgency and without demand, been willing to wait for. Sleep well. The canyon holds its watch over all of it, over the turquoise water of the falls that the Havasupai know as the surface expression of what runs beneath, over the pale limestone of the rim where the light hits first each morning, over the great unconformity where 500 million years of history is absent in the specific way that things are absent when they have been removed rather than never present, over the organized dark of the subsurface where the instruments have found what the traditions have named and the history has partially recorded, and the investigation is now reaching toward. Over the river at the bottom, patient and absolute and entirely indifferent, doing the work it has always done, making the canyon more of what it already is, revealing one layer at a time, one season at a time, one generation at a time, the inside of the Earth's long memory. Good night. The canyon is there, and what it holds is real. I have been thinking through all the hours of research that went into this story about what it means to know something, not to believe something, not to suspect something, not to have an instrument that detects something, but to know it in the fullest sense. To carry it in your body and your memory and your ceremonial practice and your relationship with the landscape, the way the Hopi and the Havasupai and the Zuni and the Navajo carry the knowledge of the passages. That kind of knowing is different from the kind of knowing that appears in peer-reviewed journals. It is deeper in some ways and less portable in others. It does not travel easily out of the context that produced it. It does not translate cleanly into the vocabulary of institutions that were built on different epistemological foundations. But it is knowing. It is the real thing. And the test of that is not how well it survives the translation, but whether it accurately describes the physical reality it is about. Whether the rock, when you finally reach it, is where the tradition said it would be. The rock is where the survey found it. The passages, the organized void spaces in the subsurface Cambrian formations, are where the traditions have been pointing. The translation is imperfect, and the investigation is incomplete, and the full reconciliation between the different kinds of knowing will take time. But the rock is there. The void spaces are there. The traditions were right about the location and the general character of what the location contains. That is the confirmation. That is the thing that the instruments provided, that the long history of institutional dismissal had not provided. Not new knowledge. Confirmation of knowledge that was already there. Knowledge that deserved to be taken seriously 100 years ago. Knowledge that is finally, now, being taken seriously in the way it deserves. The story of what lies beneath the Grand Canyon is the story of a knowledge that survived. That is the most important sentence in this entire account. The knowledge survived. It was maintained through every pressure that would have destroyed less essential and less carefully tended knowledge. It survived because the communities that held it understood its value and built the social and ceremonial structures necessary to protect it. It survived because the elders who carried it were willing to transmit it carefully, even when the world around them was doing everything possible to make that transmission difficult. It survived because the landscape itself, the canyon and its rock and its river and its specific ancient darkness, continued to be real, continued to exist as the physical referent that the knowledge was about, continued to wait for the confirmation that would eventually come. And now the confirmation has come. The instruments caught up. The survey found what the traditions described. The anomalous subsurface void structures exhibiting non-random spatial organization are in the rock where the oral tradition said something would be found. The knowledge was accurate. The knowledge survived, and the knowledge was accurate, and the knowledge is now being confirmed by independent means. That is, in the fullest sense, a completion. Not of the investigation, which continues, but of the long arc of the knowledge itself, from the first understanding of what was down there, through the millennia of careful transmission, through the century of institutional dismissal, through the moment when the instruments finally detected what the traditions had always described. The arc bends toward confirmation. It always has. The knowledge was true, and it was known to be true by the communities that held it. The world is catching up. The world will keep catching up. And the canyon, patient as the canyon always is, will be there for all of it. There is one more dimension of this story that I want to explore with you before the night gets too deep for new things. It is the dimension that the scientists are most reluctant to discuss publicly, and that the elders have been most consistent about, including in any serious account of what lies beneath the canyon. It is the dimension of purpose. Not just what is there, and not just who made it or when, but what it was for, what the underground system was designed to accomplish. What kind of human need, or what kind of relationship with the landscape, would explain the existence of something so ambitious in a place so extreme? The geological argument for natural origins cannot address this question, because natural features are not for anything. They exist because physical processes made them. The oral tradition accounts address it directly, because the traditions describe the underground passages as having been made for specific purposes, and those purposes are described in enough detail to think carefully about what they imply. The Hopi described the passages as the road of emergence, the path through which the ancestors came into this world, and as the road of return, the pathway through which specific ceremonial purposes keep the connection to the worlds below alive. The Havasupai described the passages as roads that allowed movement through the canyon in ways that the surface of the canyon did not permit. The Zuni described them as the road of the ancestors, a term that in context implies both pilgrimage and trade, the kind of movement that connects communities across distance for both sacred and practical reasons. The Navajo described them as the pathway between worlds, a description that in Navajo ceremonial context carries connotations of healing and restoration, of the kind of travel that connects the ordinary world to the sources of its renewal. These descriptions are not all the same. They are describing the same physical system from 4 different cultural perspectives, each of which emphasizes different aspects of the system's purpose, based on the specific needs and frameworks of the culture doing the describing. But they converge on a picture that is coherent across their differences, and the picture they converge on is of a system that served both practical and ceremonial purposes, that functioned simultaneously as a route for physical movement and as a sacred landscape through which humans maintained their relationship with what lay beneath and beyond the ordinary world. That dual purpose, the simultaneous practical and sacred function, is characteristic of the most significant architectural and engineering achievements of pre-Columbian North America. The great houses of Chaco Canyon were simultaneously large habitation structures and ceremonial centers, simultaneously practical buildings and nodes in a system of communication and coordination that had a profound ritual dimension. The Hohokam Canal system was simultaneously a practical irrigation network and a structure that shaped and reflected the social and ceremonial organization of the communities it served, so that the physical infrastructure of water management and the social infrastructure of community organization were inseparable. The earthworks of the Hopewell and Mississippian cultures of the eastern United States were simultaneously practical expressions of labor organization and territorial claim and ceremonial landscapes within which specific ritual practices were conducted. The pattern across these very different cultural contexts is consistent. The most ambitious engineering of pre-Columbian North America was always both practical and sacred, always both physical infrastructure and ritual landscape, always serving needs that modern Western thought tends to separate into distinct categories, but that these cultures understood as unified. The practical and the sacred were not different things. They were different aspects of the same relationship between human communities and the world those communities inhabited. If the passages beneath the Grand Canyon were the engineering achievement that the evidence suggests they might be, they would fit this pattern. They would be simultaneously practical, providing safe passage through one of the most dangerous landscapes in the continent, and ceremonially essential, providing physical access to the geographic feature at the center of the cosmological systems of the cultures that used them. They would be both road and temple, both infrastructure and sacred site, both practical necessity and spiritual covenant. They would be, in the framework of the cultures that made them, exactly what the oral traditions describe them as being: a road that connects this world to what lies beneath it, a passage that is simultaneously traveled by bodies, and by the intention of those bodies towards something that the surface world does not contain. The purpose matters because purpose is what distinguishes engineering from geology. Natural caves have no purpose. They exist because water dissolved the limestone, or because the lava tube collapsed, or because the fault shifted. They do not serve anything. They are simply there. The features that the survey detected, if they are what the oral traditions describe, and what the analysis of the data suggests, served something. They were oriented toward a goal, organized in relation to a need, made with an intention. And the intention, the convergent testimony of 4 oral traditions, is clear. They were made to allow the kind of passage that the canyon's surface made dangerous or impossible, and to maintain the relationship between the human communities of the canyon and the ground beneath them, that those communities understood as the source of their existence and the ground of their meaning. That is a purpose worthy of an engineering achievement of this scale. It is the kind of purpose that explains why communities would invest the effort and the resources and the generations of attention required to create and maintain a system as ambitious as the evidence suggests. It is the kind of purpose that connects the engineering to the cosmology, the practical to the sacred, the physical infrastructure to the living tradition that kept knowledge of it alive across centuries of every pressure that would have destroyed less essential knowledge. The underground roads are the road that the feet remember. They are the road of emergence and return. They are the pathway between worlds. They are the road of the ancestors. All four descriptions are true simultaneously, and together they describe something that no single description captures fully, which is the full significance of a physical feature to the communities whose lives were organized around it, whose cosmology was rooted in it, whose ceremonies reenacted it, whose oral traditions preserved knowledge of it through every historical disruption and institutional dismissal and scholarly condescension that the past 150 years have visited upon them. That significance is what the instruments detect as anomalous subsurface void structures, exhibiting non-random spatial organization. The significance does not appear in the data. The data captures only the physical signature, the absence of solid rock where solid rock should be, arranged in patterns that suggest intention. The significance, the meaning, the purpose, the long human story of relationship with a place so ancient and so deep that it holds the origins of entire cosmological systems, that is in the oral traditions. That is what the oral traditions carry, and that is why the oral traditions and the data belong together, not because they are saying exactly the same thing, but because each is saying what the other cannot say, and the full account requires both. The full account requires 4 oral traditions and a geophysical survey, and a retired schoolteacher's 60 documents, and the lead geophysicist, who looked at the visualization and saw a system and spent the following months developing the vocabulary to describe it. The full account requires the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office and the Havasupai Tribal Council and the Zuni archaeologists who have been working to document their own oral traditions in forms that survive contact with the institutional processes that tend to process them poorly. The full account requires the Smithsonian Archive, where Manakaja's words have been sitting for a century, and the Arizona Historical Society, where some of the early expedition reports are held, and the National Park Service Permit Office, where the applications are pending. It requires everyone who has been paying attention to this, from whatever direction and with whatever tools, and from whatever epistemological tradition, because the thing being described is too large and too old for any single perspective to hold it all. Tonight you are one more person paying attention. In whatever dark room or quiet space you are in, with whatever half-wakefulness you bring to the end of a very long story about a very old place, you are attending to something that has been waiting for more attention than it has historically received. You are one more listener at the edge of a knowledge that is too large for any single telling, but that grows, each time it is told, toward the size it needs to be to do what it needs to do, which is change how we understand the deep history of this continent and the communities that have been its longest and most attentive inhabitants. That is not a small thing. The attention of each person who comes to this story adds something to the collective attention that the story requires to be fully heard. You are part of that. Tonight, you are part of that, in the quiet way that anyone is part of anything when they listen carefully to something that matters. And now the night is deep enough that the only appropriate thing is silence. Not the silence of something finished, because the story is not finished and will not be finished for a long time, but the silence of something held, of knowledge resting in the mind before sleep, of a mystery large enough to accompany you into the dark without needing to be resolved before the light comes. The canyon is there, mile deep, 277 miles long, 2 billion years of memory in its walls, and below those walls, in the organized dark of the subsurface rock, something that the instruments have detected and the traditions have named and the history has partially preserved and the investigation is only now beginning to reach. Something patient, something real, something that has been there through every season of human attention and human inattention, every era of dismissal and every moment of recognition, Every generation of careful transmission and every disruption that threatened to break the thread held, the knowledge survived, the instruments finally became sensitive enough to confirm it. And the story is, at last, beginning to be told in a language wide enough to hold all of it. The geology and the oral tradition and the documentary history and the living research and the long human relationship with a place that is older and deeper and more significant than the official account has yet managed to acknowledge. That acknowledgement is coming. It is coming slowly and it is coming incompletely, and it will arrive in the careful, imperfect way that all important reckonings arrive, which is, with as much of the truth as the moment can hold, and with the promise, implicit in the incompleteness, of more to come. But it is coming, and you, resting now at the edge of sleep, with the canyon in your mind, and the river in your ears, and the deep old patient darkness of the rock all around, you are part of the coming. Part of the wider attention that makes room for what is being found. Part of the audience that the story has always needed and is only now beginning to have. Sleep well. The canyon waits. The passages are in the rock. The knowledge is in the living memory of the people who never stopped knowing it. The instruments have spoken. The investigation has begun. And the answer, whatever it fully turns out to be, is already somewhere in the deep, old, organized dark beneath the most ancient landscape in America. Patient and specific and entirely real, waiting for the morning and the attention and the time that all true things eventually find their way to. Good night, and thank you for listening. Let me tell you one final thing about the Great Unconformity, because I keep returning to it, and I think there is something in it that captures the whole of what this story is about in a way that nothing else quite does. The Great Unconformity is a gap. 500 million years of geological record, simply absent. The rock that should be there, that should tell the story of 500 million years of this landscape's history, is not there. It was removed. The Cambrian sea came and deposited its layers directly on top of the Precambrian basement, as if the 500 million years in between had never happened. But they did happen. The Earth was not still during those 500 million years. Things occurred. The rock recorded them. And then the rock was erased, scoured away by processes so thorough that what remains gives almost no direct evidence of what was removed. The gap is not empty. It is full of what is not there, full of the specific shape of an absence that tells you something important happened, even though you cannot read the details. Full of the weight of what was removed and the question of what caused the removal. Full of the particular significance of a boundary between what exists and what existed. A boundary that is precisely defined and still somewhat mysterious in its origins. The gap in the official record of the Grand Canyon's subsurface history is like that. Full of what was not recorded. Full of the oral tradition knowledge that was heard and filed and not followed up on. Full of the expedition reports that described anomalous features and received no institutional response. Full of the Kincaid account that was published on the front page of a newspaper and then effectively disappeared from the record. Full of the 60 archival documents that a retired schoolteacher found when she looked carefully and that had been sitting, each one individually invisible, in the archives of institutions that had never thought to look at them together. Full of the specific shape of an absence that tells you something significant happened, even though the official record does not contain the details. But the full record is not the official record. The full record includes the oral traditions and the archival documents and the survey data and the living knowledge of communities who never stop paying attention. The full record has the details. They are just in places that the official record did not, until very recently, think to look. The looking is happening now. The gap is being filled, not by new discoveries in the sense of things that were not previously known to anyone, but by the recognition that things already known to some people deserve to be taken seriously by everyone. By the acknowledgement that the gap in the official record is not a gap in knowledge, but a gap in the institutions that manage knowledge, a gap that was produced by the systematic exclusion of certain kinds of knowing from the category of things worth recording and investigating and pursuing with the full resources available. That gap is being acknowledged. That is new. It is new in the specific context of the Grand Canyon research, where the survey team is for the first time explicitly incorporating the oral traditions as part of the evidence base. And it is new in the broader context of the relationship between academic institutions and indigenous knowledge systems, where the last several decades have seen a slow but genuine shift toward recognizing that the exclusion was wrong, that the knowledge that was excluded was real, and that recovering what was lost requires the kind of careful and respectful engagement that was absent for so long. The canyon holds the record of both the gap and the filling. The Great Unconformity holds 500 million years of absence. The subsurface holds the organized dark of the passages. The walls hold the layered history of the Earth from the Cambrian Sea to the present. The handprints hold the message of specific people who wanted to say they were here. And the living traditions of the Hopi and the Havasupai, and the Zuni and the Navajo hold the knowledge that bridges the gap. The knowledge that was transmitted across the same span of time that produced the Great Unconformity and the canyon and everything we can see and everything we cannot yet see. The knowledge that will still be there when the investigation is complete and will still be there long after, patient and specific and real, in the living memory of people who never stop paying attention to the world that holds them. Good night. The canyon is there, the passages are in the rock, the knowledge survived, and the morning is coming, as it always comes, bringing more light and more questions, and the continuation of the long, patient, necessary work of understanding where we are and what has been here before us, and what we owe to the people who knew it first. There is one last thing I want to say, and it is this. The Grand Canyon is one of the most visited places on Earth. Millions of people stand at its rim every year. They take their photographs, and they feel the vertigo of the depth, and they read the interpretive signs that tell them the names of the rock formations, and the ages of the layers, and the history of the river. They learn the official story of the canyon, they carry it home with them, and most of them do not know that the official story is incomplete. Most of them do not know that the subsurface of the canyon has yielded data that cannot be explained by the existing geological models. Most of them do not know that the oral traditions of the communities that have lived with the canyon longest describe features in the rock that the survey has now detected. Most of them do not know that the institutions responsible for studying and managing this landscape have, for most of the history of that responsibility, systematically underestimated and undervalued the knowledge of the people who knew it first. You know now. That is the difference that this story makes, one listener at a time, one careful account of the full evidence at a time, one night of genuine attention to a mystery that deserves it. You know that the official story is incomplete. You know that the knowledge that fills the gap is real and has been real for a very long time. You know that the investigation is underway and that the outcome will matter. And knowing that, you are part of the wider attention that the mystery requires and has always deserved. Good night. The canyon is there. The river at the bottom of the canyon will run through the night and through the morning and through every season that comes after this one, patient and indifferent and absolute, doing the work it has always done. And the passages, if they are passages, will be in the rock through all of it. The knowledge will be in the living memory of the communities that have maintained it. The instruments will continue to accumulate data. The researchers will continue their work. The conversations will continue. The permits will be reviewed. The investigation will proceed. The story is not finished. The story is very far from finished, but it is being told now in a way it was not being told before, and that telling is itself a kind of progress, a kind of justice. A kind of beginning that the canyon and the knowledge and the communities that held that knowledge through everything deserve, and have always deserved. Rest now. Let it all settle. The canyon waits. The rock remembers. The passages hold their ancient specific silence in the deep organized dark beneath the most studied and most storied landscape in North America. And the morning will bring what the morning always brings, which is more light on what was always there. More clarity on what has always been true, more understanding of what the canyon has been holding and what the people who knew it first have been saying for as long as they have had words for it. Good night, and thank you.